9, let me hear. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Happy New Year! Oh gosh, mine doesn't work. May all the praises be for God and days of old lang syne. For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll raise a cup of kindness there for old
Happy Karim, dear colleagues and colleagues' wives. It is my honor and pleasure to open this convention. I have this lovely privilege because I am soon to finish my one-year term as your president at our closing dinner banquet on January 6th. I swear to you, fifth, pardon me, I'll try to extend my fourth, January 4th. Those of you who want me to continue, raise your hand. I swear to you that in spite of the fact in my luggage I packed 2 left shoes by mistake, I am not hung over from last night. Last night, which witnessed the very first and only Rabbi's New Year's Eve party in all of Jewish history. I'm so glad that you've read your history books. We have set a 7-year tradition for the future. Calendric investigation, I have been told, shows that the kind of constitutional dating that is demanded by our Naorrr Constitution and bylaws states that every 7th year we are going to have to meet very early in January, which will probably include New Year's Eve. Now, for those of you who may be negative to the whole complex of this calendar bylaw controversial configuration, we can put this issue on our board meeting agenda and discuss it there and not here. As outgoing president who really enjoyed the fun and joy of the Steinbrink constructed New Year's Eve party, we may need no deliberation at all. The whole question of that early January dating may be totally moot. The 2014 presidency was fraught with challenges. There was a strong, correct sentiment on the part of some Naorrr that advocated that we pull our convention out of Arizona because of the numb-minded Arizona legislation's passage of laws that would have made it virtually impossible for a woman to fulfill her American constitutionally guaranteed freedom to have an abortion. I, as well as fortunately many, many others, took it upon myself to call the office of Her Honor Jan Brewer, the governor of Arizona, requesting her to veto that upcoming legislation. And I want you to know I was not profligate with Naorr's funds. I called collect. And I got through. I was amazed, as you might have been. I offered the profound threat that we of Naorrr would consider pulling our convention out of Arizona if that awful law and repressive legislation was passed and then signed by the governor. I want you to know that such a reckless move on my part, if it had backfired, would have cost Naorrr over $30,000 in penalties for breach of contract with this hotel. But mercifully and politically, after making us and the rest of the country languor in suspense for a whole week or more, the governor finally vetoed that legislation. I presume that it was mainly because of the force of the Naorrr presidential threat, as well as by the corporations and major businesses of the country and the state, and many other outside and inside interests, such as Delta, Apple, and so on, as well as the NFL, which promised never to have a bowl, the Super Bowl in Arizona, ever. I must admit my sense of admiration of the NFL because they followed the tradition that the Jews followed, that the tradition felt that a Jew should be able to see and hear the Torah at least every third day. Shabbos, Monday, Thursday, back again to Shabbos. And they enabled the red-blooded American to watch brain-concussing professional football, not only Sunday afternoon, but Sunday night, Monday night, Thursday night, then again college bone-crushing through Shabbos entirely, morning, noon, and night, and then again on Sunday afternoon and evening. We salute them for taking our tradition to heart. Naorrr and all the multitude of corporate America and Arizona business breathed an enormous sigh of relief when she finally decisively vetoed that legislation. My own personal night sweats stopped then and there. We then faced a deeply serious loss, which you all know. The death of our dearly beloved co-executive vice president, the admired and cherished Ken Weiss. It was a tragedy for our darling Sue and seemed tragic for the infrastructure of his, her, and our cherished Naorrr. For years we had counted upon him and Sue for Naorr's functioning and existence in just about every phase of its activity. To my knowledge, the only thing that they hadn't done was give sermons and drashot. They were remarkably busy, efficient, and effective for us in every way, including that of being pleasant mentioned, friends to us all. Sue, grieving deeply, continued to function, continued to help, continued to train new leadership. And I don't think we can say enough about the way she served us and the way she continues through this convention to carry on. And I call upon Sue.
We are very blessed, it seems to me, with the ability to use words, to convey our deepest thoughts and communicate to others what needs to be said at certain times and special events that we experience together. So first, I express my heartfelt appreciation to so many of you who have reached out to me these past 8 months with sympathy, compassion, support, and encouragement. Loss and sadness and pain, these are universal in their descent upon all of us human beings. What a mystery life is, both the circumstances of our being born and the end that comes with our death. We know not how or why or when. A mystery indeed. I have felt lifted up and carried through this devastating and overwhelming loss that has come to me, my family, and all those who knew and cared for this special guy named Ken Weiss. And it is my Naorrr family who I know will be there for me as years pass, and I hopefully find some acceptance and gentle peace that comes only with time. Ken and I love Naorrr. the planning of conventions, the contacts and interaction with so many of you, the old friendships renewed, the new friendships acquired. We were honored to be your executive vice presidents for 6+ years. I am grateful also that so many of you are here with me tonight. There are many in this room who have guided and supported me through this terrible sadness. Those who sat with me at the hospital and organized a beautiful farewell. Those who came to and participated in the funeral. Those who came to my home in the months following and shared a meal with me. You are all in this room. Those who wrote touching and heartfelt letters, those who made phone call after phone call to make sure I knew they were feeling and sharing my loss. Those from the West Coast who came and participated in a memorial to Ken in Los Angeles in mid-June. And those who are helping my family create a memorial at Camp Newman in Santa Rosa, California, called Rabbi Ken's Grove, where beautiful trees will grow strong and tall year after year and provide a place where young campers can study and pray and meet and sing. There are those also who are participating in a meaningful memorial tribute to Ken here at Naorrr, and I don't know quite yet what it is, but I am so very touched by the thoughtfulness that has prompted this gesture. There are people here tonight in this room who knew Ken for longer than I did and always called him Kenny. And there are people who we both got to know more recently by coming into Naorrr. Whatever the case, I think we were all blessed to have him in our lives, and I cannot imagine not missing him forever. I have 2 mantras that continually find their way into my consciousness every day. One is, life goes on. Each day comes and goes, bringing both tears and memories, laughter and joy. But life does go on, and all of us here know that. We have all experienced it through our rabbinic life, and we have felt it in our own personal lives. This room is filled with wonderful people, some who have had more recent losses, but all who have had to say goodbye to dear congregants, friends, and family. Yet, here we are. Life goes on, and Naorrr goes on. And we will continue to say goodbye to dear colleagues each year, just as we have had to do so sadly this past week. And we will continue to welcome in new friends to our Naorrr family, for that is what and who we are. The second thought that comes to me daily, especially when I wake up each morning, comes from a song that I sang many times when I was teaching preschool and religious school. It was a way of getting across to young people the importance of gratitude for everything and everyone in our life. The song went, Baruch atah Adonai, thank you, God. And each verse described an important part of Jewish life that we are so blessed to have. The kids would sing, thank you for my mom, and thank you for my dad. They love me when I'm happy, they love me when I'm sad. And thank you for the holidays that come around every year. And thank you for our world and our friends and for waking up each day. Baruch atah Adonai, thank you, God. I have found that I cannot go on living my life without expressing gratitude for all that I have, even in the midst of such sadness and loss in my life. And I would hope that that feeling, that mitzvah, that obligation is shared with everyone here as well. Life goes on. The joys and sorrows are intermingled, and we will get through it all by expressing gratitude. And that is my prayer as we begin our 32nd annual Naorrr Convention. Baruch atah Adonai, thank you, God, for bringing us together for another year of friendship, learning, and prayer. Another year of expressing gratitude for the memory of those we have lost, for the chance also to welcome and meet new people, for the joy of hugging friends of long standing. May we enjoy and appreciate all of our days here together, never taking anything for granted, even our next breath. As we gather together, let us express gratitude to God for giving us life, for sustaining us, for enabling us to come together once again. Let us begin with Shehekianu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehekianu v'kiyamanu v'hiyanu l'zman hazeh.
Amen.
And have a lovely convention, all of us.
As your president, it was my duty to reorganize our infrastructure in order to keep progressing seemingly seamlessly. So there was no question but to carry out a replacement search. We knew Lemafreya that to reach this level of competency, menschlichkeit, and sincere human camaraderie would be difficult. I called for volunteers to come forth. The silence of the non-existent stampede was overwhelming. So it was on to the old-fashioned, non-email, non-cybernetic telephone table, and to try to catch colleagues in their early morning wake-up time or at the particularly obnoxious household dinner time. The quest, the search, then began. The Naorrr budget, I decided, wouldn't have to suffer. I have a household Watts line. It was perhaps until the dozenth personal call that a very lovely, heartwarming response came forth from one recipient who said, "Hey, this is interesting. Let me think it over and I'll call you back in a few hours." That caller called back within his suggested time, and to me the answer was along the lines of the fulfillment of divine ecstasy. He and his wife were truly interested and willing and available. When shortly after I called Dick Steinbrink, our immediate past president and New Year's party constructor, when shortly after I called Dick Steinbrink, our immediate past president, to consult, he recited that the people who had called were that gracious couple who drove us back to Logan's International Airport after the conclusion of Ken Weiss's sad funeral. He remembered immediately liking them very much, as did I. It was the greatest free ride we ever got. I called colleagues all over the country to do my own diligence, investigative homework. Every report and opinion about Frank and Beth Waldorf was positive, warm, deeply respectful, almost loving. The ensuing days and weeks and months deeply validated our initial feelings of expectation, efficiency, and good feeling, as have the past few months. The executive committee polled positively right away. If they hadn't, I would have hung up on them. The Waldorfs have been the essence of leadership, tact, kindness, and accomplishments. One of the most pleasant duties that I will ever have had as a Naorrnic president will be to call for their confirmation by the plenum of this convention. I call the plenum to confirm by acclaim the rising to office of Executive Vice Presidents Frank and Beth Waldorf. Thank goodness I stuck my neck out again. Once we were deeply saddened, and once also we have been deeply fortunate. Another aspect to this presidential opening is just going to have to wait, because if I give the whole thing now, Don Berlin, our convention program chairman will turn me into a pumpkin. He promised he would, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to hold the rest of my remarks till my president's report tomorrow. There still is a lot to say. So there's still a good amount to say. You don't have to worry about it. But welcome to Scottsdale, Arizona. Welcome to the 32nd Annual Convention of the National Association of Retired Reform Rabbis. It's wonderful to see you here, and let us say, Amen. Well, on the program, we already have confirmed the election of Frank and Beth, and that is truly a pleasure. And if I look at the program over which I am presiding, I see that the rest of the introduction of the program will be conducted by Donald Berlin, who is currently our first vice president. And if he goes on too long, I'll turn him into a pumpkin. Don?
In actuality, you did just fine. Up until the fact that we now want to introduce my classmate and good friend, Chuck Herring and Barbara, to welcome us to Phoenix. You're up.
Don, thank you for correcting the president. This convention is taking place in Phoenix, not Scottsdale. Even though the address is Scottsdale, because nobody wants to say that they live in Phoenix. Anybody go to the mall today? The Paradise Valley Mall? Paradise Valley is 3 miles that way. Well, I'm glad you got through to our governor. She doesn't talk to me. And if you think that was the worst thing that happened, my sainted father-in-law said, after moving to Arizona, I love living here. Every day, the paper gives you something to laugh about. Okay, my wife and I are making this presentation. She said, start with a song. Oh, the weather outside is Today was the coldest day in Phoenix history.
Oh, gee whiz.
There were some people from Manitoba and the Superstition Mountains taking pictures of the snow, and one lady said, it's colder here than it is at home. Well, my wife was going to say to you that every day, and this is true, we lived here for almost 50 years, every single day, she has said to me, honey, thank you for bringing me here. Tonight she won't get out of bed because she says she's freezing. She did ask me for the extra room key, however, so I hope she'll show up at some point. Anyhow, welcome to the Valley of the Sun. And if you stay long enough, we promise you that the sun will shine, the heat will warm your body. Given other predictions, you just have to stay till early February. We welcome you too on behalf of the Jewish community of Greater Phoenix, all 20,000 affiliated Jews, and 90 or so thousand who are not. There are around 40 synagogues in the community, 7 Reform, 3 Conservative, 2 Bukharian, whose combined total is 28 people, because half of them don't speak to the other half. And that's why there are 2. And finally, 23 Chabad Lubavitch. Actually, it could be 24 Chabad Lubavitch, because part of the problem with the Bukharians was that Chabad took over one of the synagogues. So it's probably 24 Chabad, but don't hold me to that. Jews have come to this region since the Civil War to serve those operating and digging in the giant mines. At one time, in the late 1800s, the tiny community of Bisbee, Arizona, which is to this day home of the Copper Queen Mine, was the largest city in America between St. Louis and San Francisco. It had more than one kosher butcher. And Jews continue to play a prominent role in the founding of Arizona as a state in 1914 and have been active in its government and communities to this day. Although since most of them are Democrats, they don't get a vote in anything. Speaking of affiliated Jews, Jews still come here from all across America. It is a community with no tradition, no institutional loyalties. If you ask a member of your congregation for a donation, they tell you, sorry, but we still give to our temple back home. So if you want a list of the names of people who say they give to your synagogue, just let us know. So enjoy our town, have a wonderful convention experience, and thanks for the opportunity to say hi.
My honor, my pleasure, and my privilege to introduce our new co-vice presidents of Naorrr, Frank and Beth Waldorf.
We're delighted to be here. We have really enjoyed our years as ordinary members of Naorrr, and now it's payback time. What has impressed us in the months since Kenny's funeral is the resilience of this organization. How so many people have stepped forward to make sure that Naorrr would remain strong and viable and meaningful in the lives of our constituency. And we are enormously grateful, certainly to Sue, who has been at our side at every stage. We're still learning from her. We'll learn from her in Boca Raton as well. Don Berlin has worked assiduously to put together a program which feels very attractive to us, and we look forward to the days that are ahead. Ehrlich, where? He's somewhere around there. He is. His IT expertise is incredible. Hillel Cohn doing the Naorrr, the applications for the registration.
The website. On the website.
Oh, the website too. Yes, we're paying for that. With wonderful humor and good sense, Harvey Tattlebaum has been a marvelous president for us.
Thank you.
And I've worked beautifully with Ralph Kingsley, your treasurer. We are enormously grateful to a whole array of other people who have been at our side and promised to continue to do so. And so we're very grateful to be able to be standing with you tonight.
But I think we want to take this personal moment, to thank you, Sue. You have been gracious in a very difficult time for you, but your heart is so big and warm and so caring, and you reach out to everyone, and you took us under your wings, and you and Kenny had such a high standard. You did so much for this beautiful community. We'll do everything we can, but it's awe-inspiring. So I want to thank you. You inspired us, you cared for us, and we love you very much. Now I'm supposed to make a segue into announcements. When you hear the announcements, there's no way to make a segue. But anyway, so under this way, I know that you already feel some empathy for us, so we're going to ask you to please be on time for the meetings. Also, we want you to bring your meal tickets, please, so that you've tucked them into your name tags, and so you'll be ready to eat and schmooze. You do not need a name tag for breakfast, and you can eat at the Tatum or at the buffet. And it's a little area in front of the Tatum restaurant.
I recommend walking all the way back. It's much better.
Which we didn't do the very first day. We thought the table wasn't in the front. Anyway, but when it comes to your health, we are concerned that you enjoy the conference. But should anything untoward happen to you, we want you to know that there's an AED and an oxygen tank at the front desk. Now tell everybody that. And that if there is an emergency, please call 911 first and then let the hotel know. Don't do it the other way around. In your package should be a list of hospitals and a pharmacy that's nearby. And if you would request a Rubbermaid bath mat, that can be obtained through the housekeeping area. I do want to announce some important meetings that many of you are going to be attending. So there are luncheon meetings tomorrow at 1 o'clock for the program nominating and Mitzvah Chesed committee. So if you are a program committee, you're meeting in Palo Verde 1, which is also on your program committee, and there are several of you. So Sandy Abraham, Jonathan Brown, Michael and Nancy Eisenstadt, Ann Foyle, Karen and Stephen Franklin, Norman and Andrea Klein, Howard Kozowski, Jean and Bobby Libby, Norman and Naomi Pates, Michael and Susan Remsen, Harvey and Barbara Rosenfeld, Mark and Sue Ellen Weiner, Stephen and Cheryl Whalen, and Hank and Barbara Zug. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And at the nominating committee, I'm sorry, Richard Klein is chairing that. Please forgive me for not saying that right away. And the nominating committee, chaired by Richard Steinbrink, please Ann Louise Balin, Jean Haddon, Bob Orkin, and Michael Eisenstadt. We hope that you'll participate in Palo Verde 2. And then the Mitzvah Chesed committee, chaired by Irvin Goldenberg, will be in Palo Verde 2B with Ralph Kingsley, Jeffrey Stiffman, Alan Hankin, and Frank Walter. Don't forget that tomorrow also there will be a board meeting on Friday at 3:45 to 5 o'clock. Now, one of the things that's very important at Naorrr is welcoming newcomers. And we're very, very lucky to have a wonderful cohort of new people. So you'll see them because on their name tags, they're going to have a little green sticker. But so that you'll be able to get to know them initially, we're going to call you, and would you please stand up so we can all welcome you, and then we can give you a round of applause when you finally added everyone's name. I hope I'm pronouncing your names correctly. Please let me know immediately if that is not so. So, Rafe, Asher, and Jennifer Rosenberg, please stand. Although you did deserve it, I think you do it. What? Just 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, clap. Oh, that's not good too. Norman and Andrea Klein. Janet Kramer, who is the guest of Howard Kozowski. Bob and Helen Kravitz. Shelley and Barbara Moss. And keep standing. Ken and Phyllis Roseman. Marty and Roberta Shaw. Marcy Howard, who was a guest of Frank Stein. Stern. Forgive me. And Cheryl Whalen and Stephen. Cheryl is the wife of Stephen. And Dan Rose, who was a guest of Steve Kaplan. And Don and Greta Slansky.
They're unpacking.
Welcome. We're so thrilled you're here. Please get to know them and include them. And who else do I need? Come here. Stand up, though. Ari Carter. Okay, we're happy you're with us, and please welcome them. Please invite them to sit with you at your tables because we want them to get to know the very welcoming community that we know we have. Let me also tell you 2 other things. We have an absolutely wonderful outreach committee. There are 10 people that make wonderful calls to those of us who can't come but would like to be part of our community. They call them at least 3 times a year. It is chaired by Sue Weiss, who has graciously said she would do it again this year. We thank you very much. There are some of you who have showed interest in helping out with this wonderful effort. And so if you would like to tell Sue or myself, Harvey, please do, because we always welcome more people into this group. And lastly, I want to say we're very fortunate to have David Spitz with us, because during the conference, he is going to be going around videoing us for our prosperity. And so don't all of a sudden say, oh my goodness, there's a camera. There will be one. So with that, those are the brief announcements. Stay healthy.
One more.
One more?
Ann Lois Bailey,
Valen.
you in the room? Ann Lois? Ann Lois. She's keeping track of when people have to go back to the airport and trying to put people together in carpools and taxi pools and limousine pools. So please sign up with her so that if you want to take advantage of her matchmaking. So thank you.
Enjoy. Well, now it's my privilege and pleasure to be able to wish you a Shana Tova and to welcome you to this convention. Your program committee has worked diligently to provide you with a diverse and we hope challenging program this week. The theme of our Naorrr 15 convention is the evolving Jewish people. Little did we realize when we selected this theme over a year ago just how timely it would be. Anti-Semitism on the rise in Europe, the Pew report illustrating a rapid decline of synagogue affiliation and Jewish identity here, and the state of Israel seemingly pivoting sharply to the political and religious right. So, evolving to something new, creative, and exciting, or perhaps evolving out of existence, a footnote to history, to a relic status, who knows? I know where all of our hearts and prayers lie. Aaron Panken, our scholar, is going to start us off tonight in a few minutes, reflecting on just how the emerging Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion is a very different college institute that we remember. In his scholarly presentations tomorrow, he's going to remind us of how change affected the Jewish people in law and literature in rabbinic times. How fortunate we are to have the privilege of studying with you, Aaron. Last year, all of you stated in some of your responses that you wanted to have more interaction with our presenters. And all of our presenters have been asked to leave sufficient time for robust discussion and participation. So while our workshops and panels will reflect different aspects of anti-Semitism, so will we be treated to insights of how change has touched our people, even comparing our experience to Native American peoplehood, and how sharply changed and divisive the state of Israel has become both there and here as an expression of who we are as a Jewish people. And all of this is going to be augmented by opportunities for eating together, praying together, studying together, singing and laughing together, and generally enjoying each other together. Now look, I want to say that like so many of you, I too was devastated by Ken Weiss's sudden death. What a bracha was his life. As has already been stated, Ken absolutely adored being a rabbi, and he was staunchly proud of Naorrr. He was quite quiet, unanxious presence, gently but firmly guiding our leadership. Sue, you lost the love of your life as you were the love of his. No matter what, mesmerized and hurting, you plunged right into the work of enabling Naorrr to maintain our course, and that's the tone that you set tonight in your opening words. It's who you are, and it strengthens all of us who have followed your leadership and continue to love you and bless you. And we say, thank you, sweet friend, for your caring, your love, and your commitment. I'm so grateful to Beth and to Frank Waldorf, long-standing friends going all the way back to our days at the college. Of course, for me, knowing that Frank is from a little shtetl called Baltimore is particularly warming. And we look forward to your following in the footsteps of the Weisses, so that you too may honor Ken's memory by continuing his legacy with all of us. You're loving, you're committed, you're astute, you're sensitive, you are our future, and we thank you for that. And as I express thanks, let me recognize the following for their diligent contributions to the program. As I recite your names, please rise and remain standing as we salute you. And I'm going to ask you to hold your applause until after we have concluded. My most supportive Naorrr colleague, who always likes to call at the most inopportune times, my colleague and my friend and our president, Harvey Tattlebaum. How wonderful you have been. And would you please stand, and along with the other members of the program committee, my own beloved best partner, Norma, Sion and Helene David, Joyce and Steve Foster, Jean and John Haddon, Arlene and Jeffrey Stiffman, Sue Ellen and Mark Weiner, Sue Weiss, Beth and Frank Waldorf. And our team was greatly supported by Irvin Ehrlich and Hillel Cohen, with a very special shout out to Dick and Diane Steinbrink, not only for contributing significantly to our program, but also for our superb New Year's Eve dinner party last night, which they arranged. And my personal gratitude goes out for all kinds of support, both financial and in other ways, to those who've made our program possible. Please join me in applauding this fine program. Final word. Let no one be alone as an individual or as a couple during your days with us. Always be on time and take time to rest whenever it's needed. We'll understand if you miss a program, but we want you to be well. And mostly, remember one thing, no matter what. The best part of the program, our being together. Enjoy. We're going to move into a very important stage in a couple of moments. My dear friend Chuck and Terry, his wife, are going to distribute something. And as they do, I'm going to take just a moment. They're joined by your cutter, Debbie Zecker. Would love. What a delight it is to have Debbie Zecker join with us here. We're going to meet all these people in time. During the course of our rabbinic world, we all have the opportunity to be part of congregations, most of us, and for some of us, We were academics, we worked as chaplains, we served in community, some of us were entrepreneurs, but there was one thing we all learned to do. And you're going to hear it a few times during the course of this conference. If you don't ask, you don't get. So we're going to take this opportunity as we get ready for our speaker to sort of hint, a little bit of a hint about asking. We're going to introduce our guest scholar more formally tomorrow. I've elected to take the privilege tonight as your chair to talk about a young man who many years ago I had the privilege of meeting in Baltimore. He was a student at Johns Hopkins University. And he called me one day. We had met, we'd gotten to know each other a little bit. He said, I know you have a youth group director in your synagogue. He's a good friend of mine. But I want to find out, Rabbi, do you have anyone whom you might be able to refer me to that might provide me with an opportunity to do some youth work? And I suggested that we turn him to the Mid-Atlantic region of the Union, in those days of American Hebrew congregations. And so was a wonderful shidduch made, one that I'm very proud of, one that has served our people and our reform movement so very well. And so when I learned that there was the possibility that he was going to become the president of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, I remembered not only that, but I also remembered that we had worked together very closely with the Placement Commission, and that he had really been a very important contributor to our work representing the College Institute. And so I took the privilege of saying, Aaron Panken, I want you to come to Naorrr and be our scholar the year after David Ellenson is our scholar, whom he was last year. And he, being the mensch, the good friend and the nice guy that he is, said, well, you know, I'm going to be overwhelmed with invitations, but this one I'm really going to consider. And he accepted the challenge, and within a few weeks of his being elected the president, he wrote and said, sign me up, I'm coming. So I want you to know that the most important thing that perhaps can be said about our president of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, I will leave to others to identify in terms of more formal, but I know him as a genuine human being, one who deeply cares about what happened before he was president, when we were all students of the Hebrew Union College, and one who is deeply committed to the kind of rabbis who will appear in the future. People of knowledge, people of integrity, people who care about the future, our destiny and our lives, and mostly how we evolve as a people. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Aaron Panken.
Say that when I was finishing my junior year of college, Don didn't mention this, but I was studying electrical engineering, and everyone laughs. It's very helpful as a rabbi to be an electrical engineer. When the public address system breaks on Rosh Hashanah, I'm incredibly valuable. So no question about that. But I wasn't sure I wanted to continue and get a PhD in electrical engineering, which was what I thought about. And I was really at a moment in my life where I wasn't sure where I was going to go. And it turns out that our meeting was really pivotal in my life in terms of helping me think of what I could do with my future. And I will always be grateful for that, because I was 19 years old. There was no way I really should have had that position as a regional youth director. I would never hire myself to do that job because I know better, but somehow they did. And in fact, I remember very well Dick Sternberger, Zichrono Livracha, who said to me, okay, we're going to give you the job, but you have to grow a beard because you don't look old enough. And I took the job. I did it for 2 years. I had incredible role models in Baltimore. Oev Sholem, Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, phenomenal people that helped me understand what it meant to be a rabbi. And that was an extraordinary experience for me, and that really is, I think, what put me on the course here. Obviously also with other things that happened along the way, but I'm very grateful for that. I also want to just say, before I actually begin to speak, that you know that joke, of course. Before I begin to speak, actually, I just want to mention one other thing, which is I'm very grateful to Naorrr because you were my first speaking invitation after I was appointed as president, which I take as either you're very interested in risk potentially, or you're very supportive. And in either case, I appreciate that very much. So thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. It is a little daunting to speak in a room where the combined experience exceeds yours by many, many years. But at the same time, I hope that over the next 3 sessions together, we'll have a chance to really do some good speaking and thinking together. As Don mentioned, just to give you a kind of brief overview, tonight I'm going to talk about rabbinic education, the evolution of the college in certain ways. I want to talk about where we're going and what we're thinking about. And a part of that will really deal with the context of the North American Jewish community. We'll talk about that for a while tonight. The sessions tomorrow are much more scholarly, and they'll really deal with rabbinic literature and with some Second Temple literature. And I do hope that this will be a little bit interactive, though I do plan on talking for about 20 to 30 minutes first, and then we'll have a chance to interact afterwards, because I do have a number of things I've been thinking about that I think are quite important for us to think about together as a community. So, in the title for tonight, we called it Context, Tradition, and Community. And we're not going to go in exactly that order. We actually are going to go in that order, but I didn't label it that at the beginning. So we're going to talk first about context. What are some of the things that I see going on in the North American Jewish context? What are some of the concerns we have? What are some of the opportunities we have, the things we need to be thinking about as a North American Jewish community, specifically in the Reform mode? Second, I want to talk about the tradition of Reform Judaism. What does it mean to be part of the Reform movement? And what did it mean and what should it mean going forward? Because I think those are actually quite different. I don't think what we meant in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s can necessarily apply directly, though there are certainly parallels and connections to what we should mean in 2010 and 2020 and 2030. And then I want to talk about the community and what are some of the changes that I see going on in the community that we need to think about. And that's both the Jewish community, the Reformed Jewish community specifically, but also the North American community in general. And from there we'll conclude, or I'll conclude at least, with some mentions of where I think we ought to go in rabbinical education. What ought we be thinking about in the way we train and the way we prepare an educational institution, a seminary, that is creating the next generation of Jewish leadership. So I want to start for tonight in thinking about the context by giving you a definition from Clayton Christensen, who wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. And he says that there are 2 kinds of technology that innovators work on. The first is a kind of technology that is sustaining. What that means is this is a technology that's been around. Think of, for example, the telephone. The telephone's an important technology. It sustains, it continues, it's something we use all the time. And it is a continuation. When you pick up your smartphone, for example, that's a continuation of a technology that already exists. You're sustaining that kind of technology. A television, for example, despite all the new things that get added to televisions, that's just kind of a build-on to a particular technology that already exists. The other kind of technology he talks about is what he calls disruptive technology. And disruptive technology is a very different sort of technology. What he means by that, I'll give you a few examples, is something that actually changes what has been taking place in a very significant way. And my first point for tonight is to say to you that I think we live in a very disruptive age, an age in which disruption is taking place much faster and in much greater ways than it has taken place in the past. Disruptive technology, for example, could have been the printing press. That was a very disruptive technology. But nowadays, disruptive technologies are coming along not every 100 years or 300 years. They're coming along every 5 to 10 years. And I'll give you, and it's even faster than that in certain cases. Let me give you a few examples of, in the last 10 years, what I see as disruptive technology. And then we'll start to apply this to the Jewish community, because there are also disruptions going on in the Jewish community. But we'll start with disruptive technology here in technology. First, think about the way, how many people have used iTunes? Think about the way music used to exist when we were growing up. You would go to a record store. In the record store, you would pull vinyl off the shelf. You would take it home. You would get either a single or a full LP. Some of us may have actually used 78s. My parents had those. I actually played a few of those too. And what's interesting was you would then have that particular album with its liner notes and everything else, and that was how you accessed music. We then moved to what I would say is sort of a sustaining technology, though a little bit disruptive, which was the CD, right? Remember CDs came in? They were easier to put in your pocket, take around, etc. And ultimately what would happen is you'd still have the liner notes and you'd still have the disc. Now, in the last 5 to 10 years, what's happened? We've moved to iTunes. iTunes is a completely different technology. Everything is transferred digitally. That improves the sound to a great extent. But what happened, you don't need to leave your house. You don't need to go to a store. All you need to do is click on something and it downloads and it's everywhere you want it to be, whether on your computer, in your pocket, etc. iTunes completely disrupted the music market. It's a completely different market. Another example, how many people take taxis? If you're taking taxis anywhere, Uber, which I know is a bad word this month, but many people don't really like Uber in the past month or two. But if you think about what Uber did to taxis, Uber actually created the opportunity for individual drivers who are not licensed, who have no particular experience in being taxi drivers and no particular regulations about them. Uber created the opportunity for any person to be able to put themselves into the system of driving taxis and making money that way. I'll give you a quick example. I'm in Los Angeles, and I have to go to someone's house and from the airport, and then I have to go back to the airport. I take a taxi from the airport to the person's house, $54. I Uber, $26 on the way back to the airport, okay? What do I get? I get a college student who's up at 5 in the morning, and he's happy to drive, and he's making some extra money with his private car. No licensing, no regulation, nothing like that. And what's happened is Uber has now started to dislodge all of the regular taxi and car services that have now been in many cities. So it's a disruptive technology because all the sustaining regular technology we're used to has now been surpassed, in a sense, by this new technology. A couple more examples, I think you probably get the point by now. Amazon. The fact that you can order pretty much almost anything in the entire world and have it arrive within about 48 hours if you pay $79 for Prime or whatever it costs now is a game changer for the big box stores, for bookstores. Everything has changed because of Amazon. E-readers, another thing. I used to get a newspaper every morning. Now I don't do that anymore. Wherever I happen to be, the New York Times comes into my little tablet. I can read it anywhere I want, and I have the entirety of it right there. And I actually think that's a splendid thing. But it has really changed the marketing. It's changed, either a paperboy doesn't really exist to a great extent anymore. And what's starting to happen is we now don't have print media in the same way. We're starting to move books and newspapers and everything else now onto that. Think of smartphones. When I was growing up, we had a question at the dining room table. What would you do if you had a question come up you didn't know at the dining room table? What would we do? The encyclopedia, the Britannica, right? You wanted a short answer, there was the micropedia. You wanted a longer answer, there was the macropedia. You had this whole great resource. What's interesting about the Britannica was there was an editorial committee for the Britannica, and they were scholars. And they sat down and went through material and came up with reasonably complete and effective scholarly answers. Try this with your grandchildren or your children. What will they do if you ask a question at the dining room table? They won't even leave the dining room table because they'll pull their smartphone out and they will Google whatever the answer is, and they will get information. Now the question, interestingly, is that information accurate? Is it vetted by anybody who really knows anything? And is it something that's up to date, or is it tremendously biased, let's say, by the particular individual who wrote it? So what's fascinating here is that the whole information game has changed dramatically as well, and that means that everyone has a much greater democratic, in a sense, access to information, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's really correct. All right, I have a good friend who's an analyst in the automotive industry. He tells me driverless cars are within the next 10 years. That we will start to see cars that drive themselves within the next 10 years. Think what that will do to the insurance companies. Think what that will do to all sorts of other subsidiary kinds of. By the way, Uber will be out of business by this other disruptive technology when you don't need a cab driver anymore, right? So that'll be interesting as well. The point is we're living in this moment of tremendous disruption. All sorts of things are changing around us because of technology, because of the reach, because of the globalization of the world. Much is taking place that is very different than what's ever happened before. Let's talk about what that does to social connections. And I wanted to give you just a few examples of what's happening to the social world, the world of the way people relate to one another in the world we live in now. My children relate to one another. They actually talk to one another because they're sometimes in bedrooms next to one another. Sometimes they talk to one another. But mostly what they do is they text one another. And when they're not texting, they're Facebook instant messaging, or they're just looking at what each one is doing in the pictures on Facebook. We don't think this way. We really don't. I'm on kind of the cusp of this. But most of us from my age and up do not really think this way. But this is the way folks are really communicating nowadays, and it's a very significant difference. Think also of the idea of communal construction of knowledge. When I go to a new city, which I happen to do quite a bit in my new job, one of the interesting things that I do is I go to TripAdvisor and I say, what are the top 30 attractions in Phoenix? Anybody know what the top attraction in Phoenix is right now?
Naorrr.
Naorrr. Actually, I think the governor vetoed that. The top attraction, never heard of it before, is there's an musical instrument museum. It's supposed to be fantastic. Now, the interesting thing is there are about 35 or 40 different attractions listed in Phoenix. Some of them are hikes, some of them are museums. There are all sorts of different things you can do. And what's fascinating about it is that was all created by social capital. In a sense, it was created by groups of individuals who rated and wrote in and said, this is good, this is bad. You have each of the individual reviews. That, by the way, now applies to restaurants through Yelp, right? It applies to trips and travel through TripAdvisor. And it's starting to apply to pretty much everything. Synagogues, by the way, and teachers. If you want to go to ratemyprofessor.com, you can actually read the reviews of lots of different professors before you take a class at most major universities. So this is interesting because there's a kind of communal knowledge that's starting to happen, which can be good, but again, you can get a lot of people to vote. And one of the interesting concerns about this is, what happens when you own a restaurant and you get all 50 of your staff to write in and to kind of corrupt the database and turn it into something that actually says, it's a great restaurant when it really isn't. So this is also a question of sort of how truth happens, and can truth really happen in the same way? Let me give you one or two other quick examples of this. FaceTime. I'm in Pittsburgh and I'm talking with a grandmother who happens to be on our board, and we're driving. This scared me a little bit. So we're driving along the streets of Pittsburgh. She's a wonderful driver until her grandchild FaceTimes her on her iPhone. Oh. And she puts the FaceTime up on the little holder and has a whole conversation back and forth with her grandchild while she's driving, okay? Now, I'm all for families loving one another. That's good. But at the same time, it's very interesting because think of the immediacy that is now created through video conferencing. The ability to actually transcend your location and be somewhere else is a tremendous, tremendous step forward, but it's also very interesting and can be very disruptive in terms of the way it functions. So that's also fascinating. I'm going to give you two more examples of interesting social developments I've seen over the last 5 years. I'm in Philadelphia at Rabbi Greg Marx's congregation, a wonderful congregation a little bit north of the city in Philly, and I'm doing a Scholar in Residence weekend, and I'm talking with the folks in the community, and they tell me about two examples that they had in the past couple of months which were amazing to me. One was a family that grew up in the congregation. Both the husband and wife grew up in the congregation. They then moved, I think, to Arizona, actually. And they're out in Arizona, and they hadn't really affiliated with the congregation or anything like that, and they had a baby. So what do? They call the rabbi. They say, we don't have enough money to come back to Philadelphia for a baby naming. Could we invite all our relatives in Philly to come to the synagogue and do a Skype baby naming? Now, this strikes me as bizarre and weird to begin with. And I think to myself, why can't they just find a nice congregation in Phoenix? Because there are apparently a lot of them. Bukharian would be a great choice. But instead, this was how they felt closest and connected to their Jewish life. So what do? They hold this baby naming. They actually have it, and all of the families, all the people who know them are sitting in Philadelphia, and they're in Arizona with a Skype camera, and the rabbi does it, and it's actually quite meaningful for everybody. As strange as I think this feels to me, there are people who now see things like this as normative, and there are people who now see things like this as interesting and possible. Second example, like this same congregation, an ill grandfather is in the hospital on the weekend of his grandson's bar mitzvah. Why couldn't we bring a Skype camera into the hospital and let him have an aliyah from the hospital to the synagogue? We all have those big screens now. Again, I feel very strange about this. I have to say, I'm not scared of the technology, but at the same time, what we've now done is we've enabled a grandfather to attend his grandson's bar mitzvah and have a meaningful experience, and it was incredibly meaningful to that family and very important. Again, disruptive technology, things are changing around us, and we have to think about what to do with them. Let me go on then to the Jewish community and some of the interesting disruptions I see in that. And again, this will kind of conclude the contextual piece of what I'm talking about, some of the things that are happening in the context around us. One of the huge contextual changes in the education of Jews in the US has been the development of Jewish studies departments in universities. That is a tremendously disruptive and interesting thing that has taken place. A couple of examples of why that's disruptive. It adds great learning to undergraduate curricula, which is very different. If you think about when HUC was founded in 1875 in Cincinnati, the people going to school at HUC were actually in high school. They did not have a college education. They certainly did not have high-level Jewish studies. It also means that you have people coming into seminaries who are sometimes at very high levels of Jewish study because they've studied 4 years in a college curriculum. And on the other hand, you have people who are electrical engineers, for example, in college, and who don't have a very high level of Jewish studies. And so you have actually some really interesting discrepancies between the levels of knowledge that you see. Day schools, by the way, add tremendously to this as well. If you've had 12 years of a day school education, you come in at a very different level than if you've had a supplementary school education that that ended, let's say, in 7th grade or 10th grade, or didn't really have much of a Jewish education. So what's fascinating about all this is Jewish studies departments put a lot of interesting pressure on seminaries because they create opportunities to raise the level of education, but that also means that we have a lot of discrepancy, a lot of difference in levels. Another example is the idea of the growth and contemporization of orthodoxy. When we think about it from the Reform rabbinic perspective, think about what's happened to orthodoxy in the last 20 years. It has gone through an incredible change. There's, in a sense, a kind of triumphalism that now orthodoxy walks around with, I think, which is very different than it was 20 and 30 years ago. We also have a contemporization. What do I mean by that? I mean that orthodoxy now has a sense of figuring out how to live within the modern world and to incorporate that into their daily practice. I'll give you a few examples of that. Websites. If you go to websites and you Google any Jewish question, who pops up first? Chabad, Aish often pops up. There are a number of Orthodox folks who show up. We have, by the way, a great thing, reformjudaism.org, which is now actually starting to come up. And if you Google, we do now show up on the first page, which is good, and we're sort of climbing, and we're getting a lot of hits, which is terrific. But at the same time, they have used these contemporary means to be able to reach a lot of people. Another example, figuring out new roles for women, figuring out new ways that Orthodoxy can be more open to the world. It's a small group in the Orthodox community, but the ones who are doing it are getting a lot of traction. So I think that's an interesting development that's disruptive as well. Here are some other disruptive developments in the Jewish community. Non-denominational synagogues. Once the first couple of synagogues decided they could be non-denominational, everyone in the denominations then said, oh, do I really have to be denominational? Is that something I have to do? So the question has been raised by the fact that there are some non-denominational synagogues, and the more of those there are, the more disruptive that becomes in a certain way. Non-denominational seminaries are another example of disruption, and the proliferation of all sorts of non-denominational Jewish organizations. That's also a large contextual change. Let me give you just two more examples of large contextual changes that affect seminary education. Pastoral counseling. has taken a tremendous rise. And in fact, with Bill Cutter in the room and some of the wonderful work that he's done in the Kaufman Institute at the Los Angeles campus, at the Blaustein Center we have in New York and also in Jerusalem, there have been some incredible things that have taken place at the college. But it's interesting because as pastoral care rises, as it's something that more and more people think about, there's a question of how much time do we dedicate to pastoral care, how much time do we dedicate to kind of core issues of Jewish learning that we traditionally would think about in seminaries. Another example is the spirituality movement, the question of people seeking spirituality. If you look at the IJS, for example, the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, a tremendously powerful force among younger folks. Lots of very interesting questions being raised by that, and all of that has an impact on the way we think about rabbinical education. So, the question then becomes, how do sustaining technologies deal with disruptive technologies? In other words, how do sustaining institutions like HUC-JAR deal with disruption around us in the Jewish community, and how does the Reform community deal with that? So I'm going to come back to that question towards the end and talk about some of the ways we are dealing with that. But I want to go on to the tradition part of the equation here. So the tradition part of the equation, for me, and this is probably very much connected to who you are, where you grew up, and what you learned as you were learning and becoming a young Jew for the first time. I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. Reform Judaism had and continues to have a very proud tradition that I think is fantastic and is something that we need to really focus on. So what was that tradition? Well, when I think of what Reform Judaism is, what our tradition is, I think of social justice, of being involved in civil rights, Soviet Jewry, all sorts of issues that mattered to society in very strong ways, standing up for what we believed in a way that wasn't just a series of resolutions, it was actually action. And I think that's a very important piece of what I perceive, at least, given my experience, to be the key to a Reform tradition. Egalitarianism. Sally Priesand was at my bar mitzvah. As she was a rabbi in my synagogue. I'm one of the first young Jews to grow up thinking it's okay to have a female rabbi. And that was an extraordinary thing the Reform movement did, and we have stood by that tremendously throughout, which is wonderful. The beginning of the welcome when I was growing up of LGBT, of gays and lesbians into the Jewish community, there was a sort of basic awakening taking place at that point. That has obviously gone a lot farther over the years and is something we stand for very strongly. Outreach, 1980 or so, when Rabbi Schindler decided that it was okay for us to be involved in outreach. I remember my confirmation class teacher at that time showing us the newspaper article, biennial must have been taking place, and reading that article and being proud of what the Reform movement was doing because we were thinking about outreach in new ways. Creative worship, music, creative services, youth leadership, questions of education, camping and NIFTY, our commitment to Israel, programs like the EIE program, NIFTY in Israel, college academic year, and a variety of other ways that we committed to Israel. All of these were part of the Reform tradition and very strong. And then I got to HUC and I learned that there was another piece to the Reform tradition, which is that the Reform tradition is rooted in Wissenschaft des Judentums. It was rooted in the idea that you actually looked with critical thought at the Jewish tradition. That was not something I really picked up, I have to say, in my earlier years in supplementary education, religious school education, or at camp. But when I got to HUC, we started to deal with that Western European approach to scholarship. But it was developed now into uniquely American Judaism. And that came about often through the writings of the Responsa Committee, through the UAHC and CCAR resolutions, and also through the actions of Sisterhood and Brotherhood, later WRJ and MRJ. So we were unique in all of these. There were no other religious movements in Judaism doing these things the way the Reform movement did. But the interesting twist on the tradition piece here is that we are no longer unique. And I see that actually as a tribute to the Reform movement. What we did became part of American Jewish life in all the parts of American Jewish life. So a couple of examples of what I mean by that. Interestingly, other movements picked up things that we did. The fact that there is now the Jewish organization, the Jewish, JAFA, Jewish Organization of Jewish Orthodox Feminists Alliance, that's what it's called. 2,000 Orthodox women who get together to talk about feminist concerns in the Orthodox movement, right? No question in my mind that that is a direct result of what the Reform movement did in breaking the ice in egalitarianism in the 60s and 70s. There's no question in my mind about that. Look at Birthright, for example. A wonderful thing, and yet it's interesting because Birthright brings people for 10-day experiences in Israel. Interestingly, that has actually dropped the number of high school kids who go on 5-week Nifty programs, right? Because people now wait till they get the free trip in college. So it's an interesting kind of dual-edged sword because other groups have started doing what we do, and they've started doing it without a denominational affiliation, and it doesn't necessarily develop any kind of connection to Reform Judaism. A couple more examples. Non-denominational seminaries produce people who have little to no training in ideology of a particular movement. They come out, and then they have to sort of sort through what their ideology is going to be when they get out in a congregation. They're also not socialized to have connections within movements. And that's also interesting because in a sense it's creating non-denominational opportunities for people to create different sorts of communities. The Jewish Outreach Institute versus the URJ's outreach department, right? The question of Panim, which is a program that does non-denominational Washington trips as opposed to going through the REC. So all of these different things have started to spring up, doing many of the things that our movement did in a way that it isn't actually, it's not based in a movement anymore, it's based outside of a movement. And that is a very interesting change in the tradition. So let's go from there finally to the sense of community and what are some of the changes that have taken place in community. And I'll just list a few of these before we get to start to thinking about what it is that we should be doing in terms of educating rabbis. So intermarriage, as has come up many, many times, if you look at the question of intermarriage, there are a number of pieces on the very positive side, a number of pieces on the very negative side. I don't have to go through all the different sides to this particular issue here. Some rabbis will officiate, some rabbis will not officiate. The question, interestingly, is what does intermarriage do to the next generations? And when I look at this and I see that the figures say that it's 20 to 25% of kids of intermarriages who grow up as Jews, that means 3/4 of the Jewish population is not making it into the next generation. That's a concern. Obviously, in the generation that follows, it's 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 7. So we've got a number of interesting challenges there, which I think are problematic. On the other hand, it's a tremendous opportunity. If we can bring the non-Jewish partner into the community and help grow the community that way, that's a wonderful opportunity. But the reality is intermarriage is up so dramatically. In the Reform community, according to the Pew study, it's over 80%. If you think about that, that is enormous. So that's a reality that's with us, and now the question is how we deal with it. That our community has changed, and we have to think about that carefully. Basic ways of making community have also changed. Watch your kids and your grandkids. One of the things you'll see is they are global. My kids meet somebody somewhere in the world. We're on some trip in Israel, in Europe, whatever it is. They exchange email addresses. They're connected to that person for the rest of their life. It may not be a very strong connection, but the connection doesn't have to be to someone near you anymore. It can be anyone, anywhere in the world. That is a very, very different situation. There's growing polarization in our community. And what's interesting about that for the Reform movement, it used to be that most of the folks in our congregations were generally democratic, generally liberal. That is not the case anymore. There's polarization within Reform congregations, and there's certainly polarization within the Jewish community. Look at AIPAC versus J Street. There are a million other examples. I don't have to give them. You understand what they are. There's also a questioning of authority and a questioning of centralization. Folks don't necessarily buy into organizations the way they used to. And because of the power of social media, you can do whatever you want with your small group of people. And they may be global, they may not be near you, but they will be connected to you and you can influence them. So the powers of influence are quite different. Finally, I think we're starting to see modes of being in a community, what it means to be in a community is shifting. And I want to actually pause here and give you a few, I think, important examples of how that's taking place before we go on to what we need to do to educate. So let me give you a couple of examples. One, first of all, from two from students of mine at the New York campus when I was teaching there. First is we have two students who decided that the relationship between Israel and the diaspora was a wreck, which may actually be a reasonable characterization of it right now. And so they actually said, we're going to try to do something to fix this. So what did they do? They created something called Project Zug. Project Zug couple is a project that effectively creates Skype partnerships between Israelis and American Jews and North American Jews. And what do? They have a curriculum where they study together, and they talk to one another about an hour a week, basically, about the issues of what does it mean to be Jewish in a global community. Great idea, free, effectively, except for the organizational costs. And this is now something that they're getting hundreds of people to participate in. Made possible by technology, making community, because people are studying together in ways that they never did before. Very exciting new possibility. Another example. We had a young woman graduate from the New York School about 3 years ago. She decided that mikveh, believe it or not, was something she wanted to create in the reform movement and beyond. So she created what's called Immerse NYC, and along the lines of the mikveh project in Boston, she created a mikveh, which isn't really quite a mikveh yet, but she's on her way, and she's teaching people how to learn about mikveh and think about mikveh from a very trans-denominational, post-denominational sort of perspective. Very interesting way of making community around something that not a lot of folks in the reform movement 30 or 40 years ago would have ever thought was something we would be doing or discussing. All right? So interesting ways to create community. Moishe House is another great example. Creating college campus places where Jews can assemble together in ways, and after college as well, in ways that brings them together in new ways that they're responsible for. And I'll give you just one more example from our Cincinnati campus, which is an example of what we call service learning. We now, through a grant from the Jewish Foundation of Cincinnati, have the opportunity for individuals to work in Jewish organizations all over the Cincinnati area. So we now have our rabbinical students working at Cedar Village, which is the home for folks who are a little bit more elderly in Cincinnati. We have folks who are involved at the hospitals, folks who are involved in all sorts of Jewish organizations, food pantries, etc. And the idea here is to actually give rabbinical students a sense that they can be part of forming different sorts of communities, not just communities that are focused on synagogue life. All right? So, what does all this mean in terms of our education? And that's what I want to think about together tonight. We're going to have a couple more minutes of some ideas that we're going to put out, and then I'd love to have a conversation about this to uphold the more interactive caveat that I have been offered. Okay? So, first of all, I want to just, one other thing I have done in my life is that I actually was involved in learning to be a pilot. I actually have been flying for over 20 years. And one of the things that I think Lenny Thal was actually in the room with me many, many years ago when we did this, we had a meeting of the CCAR and the RA to talk about rabbinical training. And one of the interesting ideas, I think, that every 20 or 30 years I have an interesting idea, and this was one of them. And so one of the interesting things that happened at that meeting was I actually got to the point where I compared rabbinical training to learning to be a pilot. All right? So why do I think about this? Well, here's what happens. First, you have to study a certain amount of theory, because you have to understand why a wing works and why a rudder works and what is actually happening theoretically to your aircraft when it's moving. Second, you then actually have to go out with a pilot and do some of these things with an instructor so you can actually get the professional skills to be able to make the plane do what it is you want the plane to do. And then finally, you have to be able to then believe in your heart that you are effective enough as a pilot to be able to go and do your first solo. There's nothing quite like the moment when your certificated flight instructor says, "You're ready," and hops out of the plane and says, "Go," right? That happens to every pilot. And by the way, that is not completely unlike your first high holiday pulpit, right? Because if you think about it, you've done all this theoretical training, people have talked to you about professional skills, but ultimately, you've got to show up and run the high holidays for some unsuspecting lay people in a small community somewhere. So I think it's very interesting to think about this, because as a pilot, you ultimately have a series of skills you want to do, but you've got to have the theory behind it, you've got to have practice at those skills, and ultimately you've also got to then have the confidence and the understanding that you believe you can do this. That is very similar to rabbinic education, and the traditional way we've constructed rabbinical education has been basically to say the following three things. We have to learn Jewish text and history, right? Conceived broadly. If you don't have that, my friends are very fond of saying, if you don't know anything about Judaism, you can be a great speaker and you won't influence anybody because you won't have anything to say. So you've got to learn text and you've got to understand Hebrew and you've got to have access to our Jewish tradition. Second thing is to think about your professional skills. And we've traditionally divided that into a variety of different professional areas. Pastoral care, you can call it pastoral, prophetic, and priestly leadership, right? I'd also add education. You have to be able to teach people. If you're not able to teach, then ultimately you can't influence people as well. So professional skills is the second point. And the third point is theological formation, the idea of worship, belief, ethics, mitzvot. What do all these pieces mean in your life, and how do you actually bring them into you theologically and understand them? So those three rubrics, I think, do stay. Everybody really has to do all those three things. But now what I'm beginning to sense in my first year, I'm now in the first day of my second year as president, which is very exciting. My wife was, by the way, very happy that I came to this conference. She thought it meant I was retiring, but I here are some of the things that I've thought about actually over the first year, very intensely, I would say. In terms of what we need to do with respect to the college, in terms of what we need to do to create the best possible curriculum for the contemporary Jewish situation. So I'm going to give actually about 8 or 10 different ideas here, and I hope this will be a springboard for us to have a conversation about this. So first of all, we need to broaden our curriculum. What I mean by that is it's not enough in this current situation, 2015, to be able to say, you learn Jewish text, you learn professional skills in the traditional areas, and then you do theological formation. That's not enough to just do those three things anymore. What we have to add is, I think our students need to understand technology, and they need to understand how you utilize technology for the formation of community, for communication with others, and how to use those tools to be able to create people who are connected to Jewish life. It was interesting, 90,000 unaffiliated versus 20,000 affiliated in the Phoenix area. What immediately springs into my mind is, what can we be doing to reach those people? They are on social media, they're connected in different ways. Where are we in terms of getting to them, right? And if we're not getting to them, there are other people who are going to be trying to get to them, and we will miss them, and they will not come to be part of our movement. Another example, another piece is broadened curriculum has to include social entrepreneurship. That means community organizing, it means thinking about how do we group people for the power that we can create through bringing them together. Think, for example, of the last couple of years. Think of the kinds of social movements that have started to crop up in North America. Ferguson, right? These are not positive pieces, but the fact that you can create a protest, the fact that Occupy Wall Street, for however long or short it was going, brought a lot of people together. The fact that in New York City, where I've lived for a long time, the West Side Highway was closed down, right? There were large swaths of Manhattan that were really, you couldn't walk through. Grand Central Station, there was a flash mob that essentially covered the entire floor of Grand Central Station. These are the negative side to some extent, but it's interesting because you think of the social power that you can harness if you think about these issues carefully. And I think that's very important for our students to understand. We need also to think about outreach and interfaith concerns. How do we create congregations that are more welcoming in light of the figure of intermarriage that we're dealing with? How do we think about creating congregations that are more welcoming, that are more friendly, that give opportunities for people to connect up with us and feel connected? And contemporary modes of education and leadership. There's much more collaboration in contemporary modes of leadership. There's a lot more sort of discussion online, the possibility of different people being involved in the discussion, as opposed to the traditional hierarchy. And I think that's an interesting piece for us to think about in terms of the authority of the rabbi and what we are thinking about when we think about training a rabbi. A second major area, deepening Hebrew and text. When we now have graduates of day schools, graduates of Jewish studies programs, people who have significant Jewish textual knowledge out there in the community, we need to up our game, I think, to be able to put people in a position where they can speak Hebrew, read Hebrew, understand Hebrew, and participate in the global conversation that's taking place in Hebrew about the state of Israel. We also need greater text skills. So one of the things we started to do at the college, and this is just the beginning, is we're now shifting the Jerusalem program to make it more immersive. I've been pushing for this quite a bit this year. So far, we've got 1 day a week, which is entirely in Hebrew. What we're going to be doing over the years to come is to move the program more and more into Hebrew, so that during the course of the year you speak less and less English, and you put yourself in a position where you come back from that year in Israel with much better Hebrew skills. Another piece we're going to do is we're going to create continuity, because one of the concerns I've heard and frankly complaints I've heard about our program is that we don't often offer enough Hebrew back on the stateside campuses to keep that Hebrew you learned in the first year going and growing. So we're going to start to work on that, and we have a variety of other modes that we want to try to play with to try to increase Hebrew skills and text skills. A third area is the integration of learning, and this is something that I learned myself as a Talmud professor, and many of my colleagues on the New York faculty and faculty on other campuses have had a really important set of conversations about. When I used to teach Talmud, I would pick an interesting rhetorical form, Shma Mina, let's say, and I would find a nice sugya, and I would teach that rhetorical form. And the sugya might be about impurity in the temple on Yom Kippur. This was a fascinating attempt at helping people feel connected to the Talmud that failed utterly. Because we don't have purity concerns anymore. We're not offering sacrifices in the temple anymore. So I could talk about all this, and it would be good from a sort of theoretical perspective, but what it was missing was immediacy and relevance to the lives of students. So about 10 years ago, we started redesigning our courses, and this is starting to happen in most of our subject areas, where instead of saying, I'm going to look at a particular rhetorical device, or I'm going to look at the history of a particular machloket, a debate over time, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say, I'm doing my introductory Talmud course. I know there are basically 10 sugyas that I can get in during the course of a semester. I'm going to pick sugyas that have all those rhetorical forms in them, but I'm also going to pick things that have relevant content in them. And I'm going to integrate the learning. So let me give you an example of 2 sugyas that I do in my Intro Talmud course until last year when I took this job and don't have time to teach anymore. But number 1, I took a sugya that dealt with the question of what happens when a shaliach tzibor messes up in the middle of a service. And how do you then keep their dignity in place, but at the same time replace them so the community can continue their worship. It's a fascinating sugya. It's got a lot of great rhetorical devices, great Hebrew, great Aramaic, everything I need to teach. But what it also gets to are the issues that people need to think about when they're leading worship, and the issues of dignity and respect for others that have to be discussed in the context of worship and ethics. Wonderful example. Another example. What happens when someone dies in your family, and you have the obligation to bury them? What other obligations are you released from, and what obligation do you have to that dead body? And that whole set of very interesting conversations, and again, that leads to questions about mourning, it leads to questions about Shiva, it leads to questions about responsibility for burial. All of those pieces make it a much more exciting and better educational experience for our rabbinical students. And so that's actually the sort of thing that we started to do around the college, is to try to integrate both the theoretical learning with the pastoral and with the other kinds of practical and professional learning. Number 4, we need to take better advantage of our unique array of schools. This is a fascinating thing that is a big college issue. We tend to run very separate programs. In New York, for example, we've got the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music right next to the Rabbinical School, right next to the School of Education. In Los Angeles, we've got the Rhea Hirsch School of Education, the Rabbinical School, and the School of Jewish Nonprofit Management, which after February 8th will be named the Zeliko School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. We got a wonderful naming gift, and we're going to really expand that program. In Cincinnati, we've got the graduate program right next to the Rabbinical School. One of the things we have to start to do at the college is to begin to use these programs to supplement one another rather than just to peacefully coexist. And I want to just give you 2 examples of that. We're in the process right now of hiring a new director for the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music. Our conception of that new directorship is that we want that person to be a person who thinks about music at the College Institute in a big way. How do rabbinical students need to learn about music so they can actually be effective partners to cantors and actually think about what we do together as opposed to thinking about these as 2 separate disciplines? The School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. So many great skills are possible if we use that school in a very different way. So for example, fundraising, development, board work, all of the different things that actually rabbis really do need to know could actually be taught by people who are experts that already teach at HUC. Now the question is, how do we start to put those programs together, and how do we do that cross-campus so all of our campuses can benefit from each of these different programs? So that's another big area we're looking at. I think we need to consciously develop new reform faculty. What I mean by that is we've hired a lot of amazing faculty over the last 10 years. I've been involved in hiring many of them myself. I'm very proud of them, and they're phenomenal. What I'm noticing is we don't have as many reform-affiliated faculty who are easily coming to mind when we go to interview faculty. They're not popping out of the woodworks. So what I think we need to do is we actually have to start to seed the process, and we have to start to think about how we take great rabbinical students, cantorial students, education students, and say to them, we'd like you to go get a PhD and come back and teach at HUC. We need money for this, frankly, and we need the ability to kind of encourage people to do this. If we don't do this, we're not going to have the kind of faculty we need to be able to continue the reform community and to build people who are going to be the next leaders in our community. Next, we need to build opportunities to shore up the foundation of Reform Jewish learning earlier. One of the things I'm most concerned about is getting students into our programs who have a great Jewish background so we have something to build upon. We don't want to be remediating all the time for people who came out of our own camps and our own organizations, our own synagogues. So we need to think about how to increase and enhance Jewish education at a much earlier level in our whole community. This is not something HUC can do by itself, but I do want to tell you about an idea we have, which we'd like to raise money for, which is called the 100X program. I'd like to find 100 exceptional individuals at the 11th grade level and at the college level, where HUC would actually start to take responsibility for doing some of that education. So if you think about it, if we look across the country, we have 870 congregations-ish. If we look across the country and we say to each of the people in these congregations, we'd like to find a 10th grade confirmation student who's finishing your program and say to them, you can continue to go to the next level by studying with HUC faculty online, by doing some learning together as cohorts at camps or in hotels or wherever it happens to take place. The point here would be to create a cadre of about 100 high school and 100 college kids who are very exciting young leaders who have much better Jewish literacy and can continue to grow over time. That's a goal for us. We've got to find the money for it, but I think it would be very worthwhile, and I also think it would help tremendously with recruitment. 3 more comments, and then we'll close up here with, and we'll have a chance to talk. Change financial aid. One of the interesting challenges that's taking place right now is Jewish studies programs are bringing PhD students, really the cream of the crop, into their PhD programs. How do they do it? They give them full tuition plus $15,000 or $20,000 a year. Rabbinical school, we are actually asking people to pay for it. So we actually need to figure out a way to change the financial aid model, to raise more endowment money, and to put ourselves in a position where we can make it possible for people to study without having to pay a significant amount of money. I don't think that's going to change 1 million minds, but I think it might change 5 or 10 really significant minds each year if we could offer that. And that's going to be a very important part going forward of thinking about where we're going to go. I think we've also finally got to place HUC-JIR at the center of promoting the intellectual life of the reform movement. And we're planning at this point to, starting in February, really ramp up our alumni online learning. You may already have received some material about this. You will certainly in the next few weeks receive all sorts of new opportunities that will be very exciting in terms of alumni learning. But we also want to start doing an annual conference where we pick an important issue and we bring together hundreds of Reform Jews to talk about this issue, mostly clergy, but also the possibility of highly educated adult lay leaders to be able to be part of this ongoing conversation. I see us as talking about issues like Israel-diaspora relations. I see us as talking about issues like science and faith. There are a million really interesting issues that we can talk about, and we want HUC to become more and more kind of the center of that intellectual conversation within the reform movement at a very high intellectual and academic level. Let me stop here. I'll have a couple of comments at the end, but what I'd like to do is just open it up because it would be great to hear from other people about where we think this is going, how you think this sounds, things you're concerned about, things you'd like to second, etc. So let me stop there. So go ahead, Bob.
Aaron, thank you. I may be incorrect with my facts, but I heard that there are 37 students in Israel this year.
Right.
What does that say about about all of the things that you've been talking about the state of the Jewish community, about the influence that our movement has. Is it economy? You know, what are you thinking about? And I'm not talking about the campus issue. I'm talking about a small number of people who are interested in being part of the Reformed Jewish community in a leadership position. That seems like a very small number.
Thank you. Did everybody hear the question, or should I repeat it? No. Okay, thank you then. No, just kidding. All right, so what Bob is asking, very good question. Bob said there are about, it may be a little bit higher than that, but it's in the 37 to 40 range right now on our Jerusalem campus for this year. Now the interesting question here is the following. What does that, Bob's question was, let me repeat it faithfully, what does that say about all the factors that I was talking about, all the kinds of questions that we've been raising tonight? So I think there are a couple of things it says. Number one, I was in Minnesota 6 months ago, and an alum came up to me at some alumni program we were doing and said, are the placement opportunities still as terrible as they were in 2008 or 2009? Actually, it was 9 and 10, I guess, were the worst 2 years, right? And I was kind of shocked by that question. So one of the interesting things is last year, you should know, we had more congregational positions than we had students. Okay, there were a couple of congregations. Alan Hankins here, and he can either verify or vilify that, depending on what he thinks. But what's interesting is we now have we really are not having problems placing people. We haven't really since 2011. In 2009 we had a lot of problems. 2010 we had some problems. 2011 and thereafter we've been doing great. So I think there are a couple of messages I would want to send to people about the low number of students. Number one. The opportunities are tremendous in the rabbinate. We're only talking about congregations. If you think about Hillels and you think about the JCCs and Federation and all the other kinds of jobs you can do as a rabbi, there are tremendous opportunities out there for rabbis right now. And I think in the current economic situation we find ourselves in this country, there are a lot of people coming out of college who don't have a job, don't have a future, don't know what to do. I think we can shift that a little bit by explaining to them that there are good economic opportunities in the rabbinate, but more importantly, that this is a meaningful and wonderful kind of life. It is an incredible thing to do to be a rabbi. And when you combine those two things, I think that's very important for people to know. And I don't think we're good at expressing that. I think we're really bad at that. One other piece I want to also do in terms of perspective. If you look back over the last 20 years, the number of students who have applied to non-Orthodox rabbinical schools has been essentially static. It has not gone down. Now, interestingly, the pie has been split by a lot more than it had been split before. So I'll give you just an example of this, how this worked. You have HUC, JTS, and RRC were kind of the major places. Remember, AJU, the American Jewish University, was a feeder school for JTS, so it wasn't a competitor, but then it became a competitor. You have Hebrew College now. You have YCT on the more orthodox end, but still pretty modern, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. You've also got AJR in the west and AJR in the east. And I think I've covered everything. There may be one or two others, but the point is, what? Which?
Hartman Institute.
Well, Hartman is not yet a rabbinical school, so it's not.
They ordained people there.
Yes, and it is not impossible that that could happen in the future, but I don't know that that's going to happen, and I know that you can't do it. Well, but they also did that in a very limited way. So when you put all this together, what's starting to happen is you've got this fragmentation of the market. Now, the interesting question is, HUC has gone down a little bit. RRC has dropped significantly. JTS has dropped significantly. Hebrew College is climbing, right? So it's an interesting question of sort of, I don't think we're much affected by Hebrew College, though here and there you get the occasional person. JTS and RRC seem to be more affected, and YCT is a little bit off more to the right. So when I look at the whole map, what's interesting is it is much more divided, and the question will be, will all the seminaries continue in the same way that they have continued? Or will some financial things cause some shifts in that, in that structure? I suspect in the next 10 to 20 years we'll see some shifts. For me, the goal here is to be sure that we do everything we possibly can to bring the most students to HUC. We have the placement opportunities. The one thing I will say about the Hebrew Union College is we've got greater faculty, we've got greater resources, we've got greater placement, we've got a greater movement. All of those things are very, very positive, and we need to get those messages out more strongly. That's what I would say in response to that question. Let's take another question. Another question or comment? Go ahead.
I've been thinking how to phrase the question, but I'd like to see you address it. What role does the college have to help people who graduated and who are ordained by the college think they have a calling, that they're connecting with God, and that the responsibility is to help other people learn how to be that way?
Did everyone hear that question? No. Okay. So what role does the college have in helping people who are ordained or about to be ordained to understand that they are connected with God, that they have a calling, and that they have to help other people? I think that's a key piece of rabbinical education. That's what I had called the idea of theological formation. That as part of the process of going through HUC, you need to be confronted with what does it mean to be in a position of authority or leadership. What does it mean to be committed? What does the idea of mitzvah mean, right? How do I take care of others? How do I participate in this? And I think all of that is part of the formation that has to take place of rabbinical students as they go through this process. Hopefully that will be well along the way, and we do it actually in a lot more thoughtful way than we used to. We have spiritual formation that students are going through, having guides they talk to on a regular basis. There's also, as part of our classes now, we have something called Mabat, which is a program that the Mandel Foundation has funded for a while. That's a program that essentially brings people together, not just in academic settings, but brings them together to think about what does this actually mean in my life, and what does it mean in terms of what I have to do and the way I should behave in the world. So that kind of prophetic leadership, I think, is very much part of what we're trying to do. Let's, I think we have one more question, is that okay? And then we'll close up. Go ahead.
What do you think are the obstacles that you will find and that the movement will find in moving in this direction? In terms of a force field analysis, there's a lot of good force coming from you, and I'm very excited to hear it. But obviously there's going to be force field the other way. How do you characterize what the pushback is going to be? Maybe the worst or hardest pushback.
Okay. Good question. Did everybody hear that question? No. No. Okay. What are some of the obstacles? What is some of the opposition that we might face in moving in some of these directions? I'll give you a couple of different examples of what I think could be opposition. Number one, there are students who come to HUC from time to time who are not so interested in text study. They're more interested in the idea of being a rabbi. And what they want to do is they want to learn great pastoral skills, and they want to take care of other people, which is all very noble and wonderful. But at the same time, they don't necessarily see the academic side of things as key. On the other hand, by the way, you have some people who are completely into the academic side and want to have nothing to do with pastoral care. They just want to teach, or they just want to talk to people or at people sometimes. And so I think one of the interesting oppositions we will face is student desire for what they want to learn, and how do we help them understand that they have to learn all the sides of this piece. That I think is an interesting piece. Another piece, I think there are really a lot of challenges on education in our movement. I think we have let education. I'm going to be very direct here, and I say this being self-critical and critical of all of us. This is all something we've all done together. I think, unfortunately, we have not assured that every kid coming out of our schools really has a good Jewish education. You ask them who Rambam is, blank look, right? That's not okay, actually, and I think we need to do better at that. And I think there's a lot of opposition to that because people are not really sure how to do that. So I think it's an interesting question of how we develop force in that direction. Let me say one last comment, Mr. Chair. I want to say, first of all, thank you for your support of the College Institute. And Chuck Kroloff, everyone knows Chuck, of course. So Chuck is actually my vice president for special projects. And I have a special project that he's been working on for a while, which is to think about how we can help support the college going forward. I will not talk anyway in this way tomorrow morning at all. We'll talk all about Torah. But I feel it is my responsibility to talk just for one moment about this, which is to say to you that when each of us went to HUC, we received scholarships, we received support. There were tremendous opportunities for people to help us go through school. And much of that really came from generations who had the foresight to think about what was necessary to continue Jewish education at its highest level. In your envelopes, you'll see the possibilities for bequests, gifts from retirement plan assets. I want to thank everyone who's a member of the 1875 Society, which is the folks who have decided to be part of planned giving for the college. And I want to ask that if you have any inkling of the possibility of supporting us in that way, Chuck Kroloff will be happy. He'll buy you coffee. He'll do whatever it is that's necessary to actually help you think about that. We also, I can certainly do that. What?
Full meal.
Full meal he will buy you. And but seriously, I would be very grateful for each of you to think about that, because that is the way the college will continue to grow and thrive in the future, and the way we'll be able to go ahead in some of these many areas. So I want to thank you all very much for being with me tonight. I look forward to studying with you tomorrow morning, and thanks so much.
Last night, Aaron Panken spoke to us about disruptive changes in our contemporary society. This morning we turn to equally unsettling shifts in Jewish life that happened over 2,000 years ago, and to the responses of our ancient predecessors that represented their attempt to preserve and enliven early rabbinic Jewish tradition. The first of these changes was the canonization of the Torah. The text was fixed, which meant that nothing new could ever be added, and that was shocking. Correlated to this was the ending of biblical prophecy a few hundred years later. If the ancestral wisdom of the biblical period was not to become fossilized and irrelevant, a way had to be found to introduce updating change into the tradition. The method they adopted was Pharisaism. The Zugot and the scholars of the late Second Temple period began to modify the received tradition by rooting their innovations in what had come before. In the old days, they said, Barishonah, the biblical worthies already had thought in novel terms. What the rabbis proposed in their minds was not really innovation, but simply an extension of what had come before. Now, of course, society continued to change. The Second Temple was destroyed, a disruptive change that was more than anybody could imagine. It would no longer be sufficient to appeal to the tradition as the source of innovation, for the challenges were more severe. A more dramatic response was needed, and this response came in the form of Tanaitic takanot. Yet as time passed, the pressure to adapt to new and varying conditions accentuated, and an even more radical technique became necessary. The rabbis of the later Tanaitic generations despaired of the flexibility of their takanot, and so they searched for another method. This they discovered in the issuance of rabbinic gezerot, decrees that were less rooted in the biblical tradition and text, and were more responsive to the realities of their contemporary world. We live in an age when the words of the Chatam Sofer, Mordechai Schreiber, who is often heard in parts of the Orthodox world, in a time when we hear frequently that Chadash Asur Min HaTorah, it is vital for us to recall the flexibility and innovative drive of the earliest days of our rabbinic tradition. To help us understand how all of this worked, we are honored and pleased to welcome to Naorrr the president of our alma mater, Rabbi Dr. Aaron Panken.
Thank you, Ken, for the beautiful introduction. I really appreciate the warm welcome. Not quite as warm as I was hoping, but it's pretty warm. So warm emotionally, let's put it that way. So it's wonderful to be here again this morning, and I've enjoyed very much also having some conversation with folks last night and this morning about what I talked about last night. So that's been very wonderful. So thanks. This morning what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes or so, and I will attempt to step down from the podium and teach from down here in just a minute or two so we can actually have some more interaction, which is, I hear, a value of Naorrr apparently, so we'll see what we can do.
Take your microphone, though.
I'll take the microphone, don't worry. What I want to do today is I want to share with you a couple of texts that are texts that I've been thinking about for a number of years. When I wrote my dissertation, actually, one of the key things that I had imagined and thought about very carefully was how rabbinic literature incorporates means of changing law. I looked for explicit examples of when the rabbis decided that law needed to change and actually explicitly, self-consciously explained that law needed to change. And the reason I did this was, A, because it's an interesting phenomenon in rabbinic literature, but B, because as a Reformed Jew, I believe very strongly that there is precedence for change and evolution in Jewish law, and it's very clear in all of our different Jewish texts. What I was looking for specifically was looking through the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Babylonian and the Palestinian Gemaras to find examples of times when the rabbis changed law, admitted it, and talked about what were the rationales that were appropriate that would propel you towards legal change. I think that creates a framework in which Reformed Jews can think about when is it appropriate for us to change as well, and when do we actually have to preserve things. So what I've done for today is I've picked about 7 or 8 examples. They're short. I've picked the Mishnaic versions. Many of them have Gemara versions that follow afterwards. But what I want to do is I want to work through them, and I want to talk about the values that underlie legal change, the ideology that the rabbis put forth that permitted them to make changes in Jewish law. So we'll take a look at that. This afternoon we're going to look not as legally, there'll be some legal material, but this afternoon I'm going to go back a little farther in time, and we're going to look at what were some of the Second Temple precursors that led to some of the things that we see in rabbinic literature. So we're sort of working our way back in time. Eventually we'll all coalesce to the Big Bang and everything will disappear again. So hopefully that won't happen until Sunday when we're all out of here. That would be good, or Monday, whatever it is. All right, so let me come down and let's see if this will work. Is that okay for everybody if I stand over here?
Good.
Yeah, that's even better, right? Because I'm louder. Very good. Okay, here we go. So start, first of all, with a wonderful little passage from a book called Society and Legal Change. And this was one of the key methodological questions that I brought in studying rabbinic texts about what does a legal change that's reported in a text actually indicate to us. So Alan Watson, who's a legal scholar, writes, there must be some relationship between the needs and desires of society and its legal rules. The forces of inertia are so great that each time a legal change is made, society reveals something important about itself. That's the key line in here that I want you to focus on. Whenever you see a legal change, there's something important going on in society, and it points to the fact that the change doesn't happen. There's enough inertia in law. Think of all the kinds of legal changes that are going on or not going on, actually, more likely, in the United States right now. Things that haven't changed. Gun control is a great example of that, right? It's just staying because there's inertia. There are people fighting the change. But there are, eventually, one hopes, there will be some sort of change that leads people to think in a different way. But it requires a certain amount of momentum that has to oppose that inertia. So when you see a legal change, society reveals something important about itself. The changes should be examined from the perspective both of the rule or principle or proposition which is created and that which is abrogated. So you have to think about the new possibility that comes out as things evolve, and you also have to think about what was abrogated, what was changed, what was left behind. All right? So take that as sort of a methodological framework as we start to move into looking at some of these texts. And we'll look at the Mishnah in this first text, which is one of my favorite texts in the entire Mishnah, because it has a really fascinating set of concerns that come to bear. I'll read in Hebrew and translate. The translation is also below, but we'll start there at the top of the page, the first part of the Hebrew on the page, under Mishnah Rosh Hashanah 2, 1 through 2. So Mishnah. And Ken spoke and mentioned that Barishonah is one of the terms that I tracked 168 times. It shows up in all of the rabbinic corpus. And most of these cases indicate a time when there was a barishonah, meaning at first there was a legal situation, and later on there was a different legal situation. All right, so this indicates the rabbis actually recognizing that there was a change in law and notating it by using this terminology. So barishonah, kol mi sherotzeh litromat hamizbeach torem. So there's a technical thing to be explained here, which is to say, what is litromat hamizbeach? we might translate that if we were just reading in modern Hebrew, it would mean something like contribute to or service the Mizbeach, the altar. What's happening here is you actually have a job that has to be done at the end of every night when you're making sacrifices on a regular basis. So when you make sacrifices all day long, there's a big pileup of ashes and bones and other kinds of stuff that stays on the altar overnight. And early in the morning, sometimes before the sun comes up or right when the sun comes up, you have people who are actually cleaning the altar and preparing it for use again the next day. This, by the way, is one of those examples that doesn't give you a useful example for your synagogue life directly quite yet, but it will in a minute, okay? So the question here is, when people had to clean the altar and get it ready for the next day's sacrifices, how did they go about assigning that task, giving that task to the person who was going to do that? So take a look what happens. At the beginning, Barishonah, Kol mi sherotzeh litrom et hamizbeach torem. Anyone who wanted to do this service of cleaning the ashes off the mizbeach, the altar, could just do it. They would torem. They can just walk up and do it. There's no problem. Okay? Now, here's the interesting issue. This is what I might call an early stage community, where everyone can join, anybody can be part of anything. There are no committees. There's no organizational structure really to the whole community in a certain way. Just anyone who wants to be part of it can just come and join. So watch what happens now. Uvizman shehen merubin, but at a time when there are many, many people who want to do this trumah, who want to do this service to the altar, cleaning the ashes off, ratzin va'olim b'chevesh. They would run and they would go up the chevesh. Chevesh is a biblical word that actually means a ramp. Okay, it's a ramp. By the way, in the Tosefta, there's a parallel here where they use the word scala, the Italian ladder. So we don't know if it was a ramp or a ladder, but it was something that led you, probably a ramp leading you up to where the altar was. All right, so when a lot of them are coming up, they would run and they would go up the ramp. Kol hakodem et chavero be'arba amot zacha. Anyone who beat his competition up the ramp would win. They would zakah, they'd win. Right? So what did this mean? What's the method of selection for who gets to clean the altar in this first stage? Say again? Speed, okay? Whoever's the fastest one running up this ramp, who gets into the Arba Amot, the domain of the altar, once you've crossed into that domain of the altar, you then get to do the service of cleaning the altar. Anybody ever go to summer camp and play basketball? There was a kid in my summer camp who every time was so much better at basketball than anybody else in the bunk. Of course, he always got to do everything. And you would sort of stand around the court watching because you just didn't have the ability to kind of catch up. So the interesting problem when you see a system like this is selecting for fast, it may be selecting for pushy, it may be selecting for all sorts of things, but it's not necessarily the kind of selection you want to use for giving a person the honor of taking care of the altar. So interestingly, that's the way it was at the beginning. Now, let's see what happens. There's one more cute element here I want to add. V'im hayu shnehem shavin. If two of them arrived equally, exactly at the same time, hamemuneh, the appointed one, omer lahem hatzbiyu. The memuneh, the appointed one, would say, once, twice, three, shoot. I'm not kidding you, actually. Watch what happens next. Umahen motzi'in, what would they stick out? Echad ushtayim. They would stick out one or two fingers. And that's actually how they would decide. Now this is wonderful because what it's done is you have an actual challenge of how you're going to decide if two people arrived equally, who gets to do this. Once, twice, three, shoot. One or two, you call evens or odds. I don't know if it's exactly the same game, but it's clear some finger game is going on that actually figures out how it is that you get decided to do the altar or not. Ve'ein motzin agodel b'mikdash. You don't stick your thumb out in the mikdash. You may know that this is still kind of a curse in the Middle East. Sticking your thumb out is not something you would do in the mikdash, okay? So, a very nice system. Everything's working perfectly. Whoever runs fastest, if you have equality, you can figure out what to do then. You have a way of resolving a tie. Everything's good. Now watch what happens next. Ma'aseh. So ma'aseh indicates there's a case, potentially a story. I think in this case it means a case. Ma'aseh shahiyu shneihen shavim v'ratzin v'olim b'chevesh. So there's a case where two of them were equal, and they were running up and down on the kevesh. V'dachaf echad mihen et chavero. And one of them pushed the other V'nafal v'nishbara raglo. And he fell and he broke his leg. So what have we realized about the way our system works when we see that this situation might come up, that someone could push someone else and they could fall and break their leg? What? It ain't working. Okay, and let's make it a little bit, what's wrong with breaking your leg if you're a Kohen in the temple? You are disqualified forever from being a Kohen and working in the temple anymore. So what's interesting here is we now have a problem. We've got a system that's been working for a while, and as they're running up this ramp, we see now that there's a situation that can come up where someone can get hurt and disqualified. I will tell you also, go read this at home, in the Bavli, one stabs the other. It gets even worse. So there are interesting situations here going on where competition has now led to anger, to frustration, and to the harming of individuals. So watch what the rabbis do. V'kevan shera'u beit din sheba'in lidei sakana. When the Beit Din saw that they were coming into danger, hitkinu shelo yehu tormin et hamizbeach ele b'fayis. They made a takana, they made a change to Jewish law, an enactment, that said they would do this through a lottery instead. And what that meant was they would then pre-organize who was going to go up on what day to be able to do this service in the temple. The service still has to get done, the altar still has to get cleaned, but now you were selecting with what criterion? What? Luck, randomness. Who controls luck in the rabbinic mind? God. God is choosing. So what's now happened is, instead of choosing for athletic prowess, for the ability to push your fellow harder than the other fellow pushes you, or for any of those other qualities, now what we have is we have now assigned, in a sense, the idea to luck, and we've made it so that there's an equal chance for every human being, or at least every male Kohen who's involved here, to be able to be selected. And we've organized the system so there isn't a whole group of people running up and trying to mob the altar. Okay? Very interesting. It then goes on, one last comment, it then goes on to mention that there were 4 different paisot, there were 4 different lotteries that were assigning people to tasks in the temple. So, quick summary comment before I turn to you, Bob. The summary comment is, we've got a system, the system works, but all of a sudden an incident comes along and it shows that there's a problem with the system. The rabbis don't say, that's the way the system has always been, we're going to continue it the way it's always been. They think, let's figure out a new way to manage this system so no one gets hurt, so the job gets done appropriately, and so we put the selection criteria in line with our values. Bob?
Just a question.
Yeah.
In terms of the law here, there was no suggestion that the rule was in any way divinely ordained.
No.
Right? So they're not changing God's law, they're changing pre-existing
Correct.
custom.
There are cases. It's custom. I'd say it's a little stronger than custom because we're not using the word minhag, right? So it doesn't relegate it to the category of specifically minhag, but it is clear that these are tasks that the rabbis want to define, and I would call that a legal task to actually define that. I think it's law. I think it's reasonable to call it law. The one thing I will say is there are also times when the rabbis do things with biblical law, but they are much more circumspect about how they do it,
That's my point.
because they don't want to get into too much of abrogation of biblical law that's out there. Though there are some cases when that happens too. Yeah, Rifat, hi.
If my memory serves me right, there is a parallel to this in the Mishnah with regard to the lulav, whether you can carry the lulav on Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
My memory serves me right is that at the beginning they used to bring the lulavim and leave them at the temple.
Yep.
And then they would throw them down,
Yep.
and each one would carry one.
Yes.
And one year they fought.
Yep.
with one. They hit one another. And then the takana was issued
Yep.
on Shabbat.
You are absolutely right, and in fact Josephus also has some interesting stories about this, where they would leave the lulavim and etrox in the temple,
Right.
and you give them as a gift to your fellow, so that basically your fellow could use it, because you can't take a stolen lulav and use it. But apparently there was a big melee, and lulavs were flying everywhere, and people were hurt quite badly, and hitting each other and everything else. There are a couple of different stories of that. One is throwing lulavs to one another in a very friendly way, but hurting people by accident, and the other is, actually whacking people with lulavs. So all sorts of different, don't try this at home, is all I would say. Okay, before I go on from this text, everybody understand the point I'm making? So one of the points here is law needs to change when you find an incident that shows that your law doesn't function correctly. that it brings danger to someone, it causes a deleterious effect to someone, and you must therefore make it change, right? That, I think, is a wonderful legal principle, a wonderful kind of meta principle legally that allows us to think about when do we need to change law. Are there people being hurt by the way our law is structured? Are there people being put in danger, and do we need to respond to that? That's probably a very clear example. Turn to the next page, if you would. And I'm going to give you a complicated halachic system or question here that talks about a different sort of legal change. And this is a very interesting one that appears not that many times, about 8 or 9 times throughout the Mishnah and the various Talmuds. And it's from Mishnah Nedarim 9:6. Nedarim is about neders. Neder, what is a neder? Anybody remember? It's a vow. And what's an example of a neder? Can anybody give me just a good example? How do you make a neder if you were going to make one? Go ahead.
If I arrive home safely, I'll give it the
Okay, so if something happens, I will do something, okay? And the one thing you need to make sure you include in that is the use of God's name, right? Because it's not a neder, it's just a simple promise. Unless you use certain ones of God's names, the Mishnah goes on, and so do the Talmuds, for a long time talking about what names of God are included in making something effectively a neder. The power of a neder is that if you make a promise with God's name and you don't follow through, you will then be guilty of chilul Hashem, who will be guilty of the violation of God's name, and so therefore you don't want to do that. So that's the power behind a neder. The nederim that we're talking about right here is a neder of a specific kind, which is a neder to fast. If I say, for example, I'm going to fast for 40 days, and I use God's name, right? People often say bli neder when they say something like that, just to be safe. I'll do that. So if I say I, using God's name, bli neder, will fast for 40 days, then I have made a vow that I will fast for 40 days. Now, there's a challenge to making a vow that you can fast for 40 days. What might that challenge be? What could be a problem with making a fast like that? You might die. Very good. Okay, so possibly dying is one bad challenge to that vow. What's another challenge to that vow? What? Say again? You might get sick. Good. Which might lead to dying. Okay, good. Yeah. Somebody else might what?
Force you to eat.
So someone might force you to eat, but then maybe it's against your will, so you'll be okay. There's one other problem. Yeah.
You set a precedent to harm others.
You could set a precedent to harm other people. How so? What do you mean?
Convince other people to be anorexic.
Oh, interesting. All right, so bad modeling. Okay. All right, good. Shabbos and Yom Tov. That's a problem. Okay? You are actually not allowed to fast on Shabbat. Shabbat's supposed to be a time of joy. You're not supposed to fast during a time of joy because it actually takes away from your joy. And in fact, on top of that, things like the concept of Oneg Shabbat obligate you to eating delicious things on Shabbat. It's interesting. We go to an Oneg Shabbat, which we think of as brownies and cookies, but Oneg Shabbat has an earlier tradition in which you were kind of obligated to eat fish or chicken. In certain circles, Bastia, which is that pigeon pie that they make in Morocco, is actually mentioned in some medieval texts as something you should eat on Shabbat because it's a higher level of eating. So we've got a problem if you say I'm going to fast and you make a neder, then I'm going to fast for 40 days. Because when you do that, you have within there 7 or 8 different Shabbatot, and possibly some Yom Tovs as well, that would be a problem for you not to eat on. Okay, so this is the challenge that comes up in the Mishnah here. And the question is, how do we release people from vows? That's the whole section in Mishnah Nedarim 9. They're talking about how to get people out of vows. And do anyone remember how you get someone out of a vow? Sing Kol Nidre, yeah, that's later. Okay, yeah.
You find out that he didn't really understand what he was saying.
Okay, so one way to get people out of vows is to say, at the time that he or she made this vow, they didn't fully understand the implications, the complete legal situation they're in, and therefore I can release them. To do that, however, you need to go to a certain person, which is a Talmid Chacham, a Chacham, someone who is wise, who understands the laws of vows and can release you from that vow, because they have to look at all the legal implications and make sure that everything's understood. So now the question here, and finally that's the background for the law we're about to look at. We get to the question of getting people out of this silly vow that they made that they're going to fast for 40 days. The reason we have to get them out is because they can't do it. There's a lack of integrity to the vow because any normal person would know that Shabbat or a Yom Tov would come along in there, and therefore the vow's a problem. So everybody understand the setup for that? Take a look at the Mishnah with me.
By the way, just because some people...
Steve, sure.
fast for 40 days would presumably mean a daylight hours only fast.
That's a whole other issue that comes along here too, right? And if we say 40 days, and that's one of the reasons. Yeah, Steve brought up the fact that fasting for 40 days only means during the day. You can kind of do it, as I like to call it, Ramadan style, right? Where you just eat at night and everything's fine during the day, and that works out okay. So you could fast for 40 days, and that's how you would get out of the death problem, right? You don't have the death problem. But the Shabbat problem still, the Shabbat and Yom Tov problem is still there. Okay? So let's look at what happens. Potrim b'yamim tovim u'v'shabbatot. So what we're hearing at the beginning of this Mishnah is that a chacham, a wise person, or wise people, or a beit din, can release individuals, they can poteach, open the vow, through the mechanism of Shabbatot and Yom Tov. They can say, look at your vow, you made a vow for fasting for 40 days, I'm going to release you from that vow because there's no integrity to that vow, and therefore, because there's no integrity, I can use Shabbat and Yom Tov as a problem of integrity for that vow, and therefore release you. Everybody see what happened? Does that make sense? Everybody okay with that? What's the problem with that? So if I say essentially you're released entirely from your whole vow, you just vowed using God's name to fast for 40 days, and I'm going to release you from the entirety of that vow because of the Shabbat and Yom Tov factor, which is at most 5 or 6 or 7 days, maybe a little more throughout that time period. What's the problem with what I've just done?
What about all the other vows?
Well, what the other?
Yeah, all the other vows you're going to make became out of the night.
Okay, well, all the other vows or all the other days, right? In other words, all the other days, you still have a vow, on paper in a sense, that says you should fast for all the other days. Why should I release you from all of the days through Shabbatot and Yom Tov? That's a challenge. So potchim b'yamim tovim u'v'shabbatot. So now the question is, how do we deal with this? Barishona hayu omrim. At the beginning, they used to say, "Otan hayamim mutarin u'sha'ar kol hayamim asurin." So they used to say, what we're going to do with this vow is we're going to say that you fast for all the days that are not Shabbat and Yom Tov, and on Shabbat and Yom Tov you don't fast because we can only release you from Shabbat and Yom Tov. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Should I say it again? Let me say it one more time, because I'm not sure I understood it, so this will be helpful, okay? If we can let you out for Shabbat and Yom Tov, the question is, should we let you out of just Shabbat and Yom Tov? Or should we let you out of all 40 days of your vow?
Or you could vow for 36 days.
Well, right. So now the other question is, would we have to extend it to make more days after Shabbat and Yom Tov? That actually the Mishnah doesn't address, because there's a limit even to their patience. You know what I'm saying? But the question here, interestingly, is whether you should get out of all 40 days entirely, whether the whole vow lacks integrity, or whether we can release you just from Shabbat and Yom Tov. So the beginning, Barishonah, the beginning, they used to say you would fast for all the days except Shabbat and Yom Tov. Everybody understand that position? It makes sense because you can't fast on Shabbat and Yom Tov. That doesn't get you out of everything. Until, watch what happens next. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva v'lamad, or v'limed probably, shehaneder shehutar mikzato hutar kulo. Rabbi Akiva comes along and he says, and he teaches, which is an interesting use of the word limed here, even though there's no yud, I think that's the way it should be pointed. Shehaneder, that the neder, where part of it has been released, all of it has to be released. Rabbi Akiva comes along and he says, a neder like this has to have complete integrity, otherwise the entirety of it gets released. It cancels it all. So Rabbi Akiva comes along and he, interestingly, he reads the vow in a stricter way, but comes out with a more lenient outcome. He releases the person from the entirety of all 40 days, but he's reading it in a very strict way. So it's actually kind of a fascinating thing. So here's another example of a kind of legal change. You think you understand that you can have an imperfect vow and still uphold part of it. Rabbi Akiva reads it differently. He teaches the philosophy that a vow has to have complete integrity, and if it doesn't have complete integrity, the entire thing is off. And his teaching actually changes the way law is enacted in terms of vows and the questions of what people do in situations like this. So a second point here, when does legal change take place? It takes place when a great teacher comes along and teaches you to rethink your position on a particular issue. Rabbi Akiva has now changed the way all these vows in this situation would be handled, and that tells us that teaching and helping people reconceive from a different philosophical perspective, can lead to legal change as well. And that's good. And the rabbis like that, and they think that's right. Go ahead, Floyd.
It doesn't say fast in here. Somewhere else it may say
In the rest of the Mishnah in this paragraph, it does.
Does it apply to all vows or simply vows of fasting which can't be observed on Shabbat and Yom Tov?
It would apply to other kinds of vows that have conflicting problems like the fast, yes. So for example, if, I'm sure it's probably hard to formulate a good example of this, but let's say you make a vow in your family. There's a great example in the Bavli where someone vows never to receive any benefit from his child, and then his child gets married, and the question is, can he go to the wedding or not? Okay, so that's a really interesting question. They figure out a way to get around it so they can be together, but then there's a critique of whether or not they should have done that. That would be a similar kind of thing, because there are other values that would play in here that would conflict with the value you need. Yeah, Michael.
It seems to me that it's almost like saying this. The Chachamim, if they can release from part of a vow, or because the formula of the vow is contradictory, it's void ab initio, like someone saying, marry me on condition that I'm a Kohen, but he's not.
Right.
All right? But you don't have to be released from because it's void ab initio.
Right. Those are the two legal positions. And interestingly, the presence of Rabbi Akiva, and the fascinating thing about this, by the way, is that the 8 or 9 times this occurs, this formula, Rabbi Akiva is the only one who does it. There are 1 or 2 other smaller cases, but in major halakhic situations, it's Rabbi Akiva. That tells me another thing, which is Rabbi Akiva obviously had tremendous standing in this community, and either they did this in his name to utilize his authority because they thought this was a little bit far out, or potentially he was a teacher who did make all these changes and led the community to reconceive important pieces. So, very interesting kind of thing. Let's take one more comment, then we'll move on. Yes?
Do we know anything about Rabbi Akiva's reasoning, why he chose to make that?
So interestingly, Rabbi Akiva does, in all the cases, he's a little more lenient than the other opinions that are on the page. So I also think that Rabbi Akiva had an agenda here, assuming, by the way, there's a debate whether or not if something is attributed to someone, it was really done by him, so I'm going to be a little cautious on that. But assuming the attribution issue doesn't play here, and these are real good attributions, if that's the case, then maybe Rabbi Akiva had an agenda of leniency in certain cases. And I think it's likely that's the case, but I wouldn't go that far out on the tree limb because it might collapse under me. Okay? Professor.
But it is possible Akiva is given credit for the famous Menachot passage. Torah Moshe Sinai about Akiva's teaching, which is fairly radical. So, isn't it possible? You're the teacher here, but they fabricated an Akiva who's a radical reader?
It could be they fabricated him. It could be he was, right? I think both of those are possibilities, and I think both of them are quite likely. But I don't know which one is true. That's the problem. So. All right, let's go on to a couple more. So take a look at Mishnah Sukkah 3:12. This is actually relating to the lulav, and it's talking about what happens when you have a catastrophic historical event. I think, for example, by the way, of the Reform position on saying the Kaddish communally together. If you look at the responsa from about right after the Holocaust, interestingly, the Reform movement has a responsum that I read not too long ago that talks about the fact that we all say Kaddish together. And that, of course, drives lots of people crazy in the rest of the Jewish community, and they always wonder why that is. And I've been asked that question a number of times. I'm sure most people in the room, or many people in the room, have been. And interestingly, the responsum actually says that after the Holocaust happens, we have so many people who have died that ultimately there's no one to say Kaddish for them. And instead of just saying no one's going to say Kaddish, we actually will take on the communal responsibility and say Kaddish all together for them. That is our response to a catastrophic historical event that changes halachically what we do and the way we actually do something. Yeah.
At what time would that takana dissipate?
Great question. I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Because when all the possible descendants of the guy in the Holocaust is dead, would you then cancel that?
It's a great question. So Ari has asked a wonderful question, which I really don't know the answer. How long would that takana, how long would that go on? And would there come a time when after all a generation or two has passed, and there would be no one there to say Kaddish for those who had passed away? Should we continue it? And it's a good question. we should email Mark Wachowski and find out from him. That's probably the best thing to do. So anyway, back in history, we're going to look back in the Mishnah here and try to figure out what happened with the different historical events. So take a look at Mishnah Sukkah 3:12. Barishona haya lulav nital b'mikdash shiv'a uvamedina yom echad. So how was the lulav waved during the time of the temple? In the beginning phase, the lulav was taken up b'mikdash in the temple itself for 7 days. All right, and it was taken up b'medina, which means in the city, for 1 day. So interestingly, there was a discrepancy or a difference, a distinction in the observance of the lulav. It was done for 7 days in the temple, but outside in the city, or probably potentially even farther afield outside of Jerusalem, though depends how you read the word b'medina, it was done in a way that was only 1 day. So that's very interesting, and most people don't know that there was, the Mishnah at least reports that discrepancy in the way lulav was observed during this time. But now the question happens, what happens when the temple is destroyed? So Misha Harav Beit HaMikdash, once the temple is destroyed, Hitkin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Sheyehe Lulav Nital B'Medina Shiv'a Zecher LaMikdash. Very interesting statement here. Once the temple is destroyed, then Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai enacts a different law. That law says, from now on, instead of just doing it 1 day b'Medina, in the city or in the area surrounding the temple, outside in Jerusalem, we are now going to do it for 7 days. So what's happened is the practice that was in the temple for 7 days, but wasn't allowed in the rest of the area around the temple in Palestine, now has become the practice that's done all the time. And by the way, that's what we do. We pick up the lulav 7 days, and that's because of this teaching of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, this enactment. What's fascinating to me is, A, the change, because once the temple is destroyed, you don't have a locus as a sort of center of observance that is higher than anywhere else. And from that perspective now, everywhere becomes, in a sense, the temple. That's kind of an interesting move. They didn't say, let everywhere it be done 1 day. They let everywhere do it 7 days. The other interesting thing is the justification. Zecher LeMikdash. Sometimes there are laws and there are customs that you continue to do as a remembrance of something that came before, even though they're different than they used to be done. So this is interesting because what's happened now is the lifting up of the lulav for 7 days becomes in a sense, the reminder to everyone of the existence of the temple in a time when the temple doesn't exist anymore. So that is quite fascinating. What's happened is you've got a symbol that changes its meaning. It still is connected to Sukkah, it still is connected to lulav in the Bible, but at the same time it becomes now Zecher LaMikdash. It becomes a reminder of how things used to be done. So there are times when you change the way law is applied, or change the way law actually functions, to keep alive something that was important to you before, even though you can't do it the same way you used to. And I think that's an interesting point. Now note one other thing here. V'sheyehei yom henef kulo asur. There was a waving ceremony which used to take place at the temple. That they decided couldn't continue. They didn't say, do yom henef, don't wave your grain all over the place in the land of Israel. They just said this doesn't work anymore. So note what's happening here. You have a sorting. You have a change in condition, significant catastrophic change. You have to say, what are we going to continue after that catastrophic change? And what are some of the things that we can't continue? Some things make it, some things don't. Your response to that historical circumstance change is something you have to decide when that happens. Okay, let me stop there. Any questions or comments on that? Yeah, Mike?
Wait, you do this now. Before it was done in the temple, all right, but now you do it, everybody does it outside Zecher LaMikdash. It now becomes parallel to what you said a moment ago. Now we all say Zecher LaKorban.
Right, exactly. So, and note, by the way, that this has moved in a way that is very common. This is no surprise in rabbinic literature because it's moved from something that's been done by the Kohanim in a very limited way to everybody being involved, right? Everyone now gets to do it.
So done by the mourners and the limited.
Yeah, exactly right. And this is why I brought that parallel. So, thank you. We had a comment in the back. Go ahead.
How does this apply to Yom Tov Sheni?
Well, Yom Tov Sheni doesn't happen actually in Palestine, in the land of Israel, right? So we don't have to actually worry about that. That's why I like reading Mishnah. You don't have any of that messy Yom Tov Sheni stuff that, Mr. President.
In these texts, when they explain the circumstances that dictate the change, do any of them articulate expressly the authority on which they base the change?
They generally do not. I mean, the closest that comes to this is the utilization of particular names, like Rabbi Akiva, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. There are a couple of pivotal figures who do things that are major changes and recur a number of times. So I think really they don't actually, sometimes, by the way, we also saw a Beit Din, right, in the first passage, a Beit Din. So there are particular individual authorities and particular communal authorities that will be involved in a sense, powering the authority structure that allows this to happen.
Not articulating the basis of their authority.
They are not explicit about that, which means that they either assumed, that everyone bought into this, which is possible, or they just weren't thinking about it. I'm not. It would be great if they did, but I have not seen an example where they did. Yeah, Steve.
Maybe this is connected with not yet don't proceed. But what about the blowing of shofar on
Shabbat? Yeah. And if I recall correctly, that was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai working on that too, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong. Yes, they did. Right.
He said, I've already got the shofar, let me just blow it and then we'll talk.
Right, and he said, we'll decide. He blows the shofar and then it's done already. So that's exactly right. So that's another great example of having to change what happens as historical circumstances change. Perfect, wonderful parallel. Last comment, let's go on.
General question about all of this. By the time this is written, the temple has been destroyed for 200 years.
Correct.
So does this simply legalize practice that was already in effect, that grew up somehow, some way, maybe lost in the midst of time when the rabbinic period started?
It's a great question, and that is another one of those questions which I will repeat the question because it is a good question. So the question is this. Since the Mishnah is written about 130 years, let's say 130 to 150 or 60 years after the destruction of the temple, are we just simply sort of telling a story about the way this built? Are we memorializing the way law changed? You're asking a question of really accuracy, right? Are these texts historically accurate or not? I don't know the answer. What I do know is that if rabbis we respect and treasure, obviously as part of our heritage, are talking about legal change, I'm actually less interested, and maybe this is because of the discipline in which I find myself, I'm less interested in whether this historically happened or not. I'm more interested in the literary texts themselves and what that implies about what the rabbis thought about legal change. I believe that we can't really know with certainty what happened historically in these cases. I just don't think there's enough evidence. But I think we can say, historically, these texts indicate a certain approach to legal change philosophically, and that's important for us to think about.
The text that I used at the beginning of Brachot, about reciting the Shema.
Right.
Someplace they started reciting the Shema.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
legalized it in the Mishnah.
And then they told the story of how that started, and in the telling the story, you can pull out certain aspects of how that started. Whether that is absolutely historically correct, it's very hard to say. It's very hard to say. I'm trying to be careful about that stuff and not just assume that it's right. And that's because for a while, I assumed it was right at the beginning of graduate school, and enough of my professors beat me over the head and prevented that from happening again. So let's go on to another one. Let's look at Mishnah Gittin 4.2. This is actually the original, earliest mention of the words Tikkun HaOlam in the entire world. And you will see, I think, that it means something very different than the lovely crunchy granola thing that we like as Tikkun Olam in the Reform movement. It's very different, and it is connected, and it's kind of interesting what we find here. So this is an example of divorce, and it's a very interesting example of divorce, which has a really kind of dynamic human element that I enjoy sharing because it's such a wonderful kind of human example of how people behave and misbehave. So, and I think that's probably, we may have time for one more after that. I think maybe we'll have time for one more. But take a look with me at the text. So, Barishona haya oseh beit din b'makom acher u'mevatlo. What in the world is going on? This is Mishnaic shorthand. Here's the situation. I am married to a woman. I decide that I'm going to divorce her. We are not in the same place. She is a couple of days walk away from me, or something like that, far away. I give my shaliach, my agent, a get, and I say, take this to my wife. The agent walks towards the wife. Luckily, there were no planes or anything like that, and no email, so it didn't happen quickly. The agent is walking towards the wife with the get. I have a change of heart. and I decide that I still love my wife and I don't want to divorce her. So in the beginning, the situation was I could convene a Beit Din. After all, the get is a legal document. I could convene a court and I could say, I want to cancel that document. And the document would be canceled. That's very nice. I am still married to my wife. What's the problem with that system? Here's the problem. That agent is still walking with a very valid looking get toward my wife, who then gets that get in her hand, and then immediately runs to see the milkman she's always admired. And she believes she is divorced, so she didn't do anything wrong, but she actually goes out and consummates, let's say, and potentially has a child with that milkman. The milkman's child is therefore a mamzer because he or she has been conceived through adulterous relations. But my wife never knew that. Okay? Everybody see the problem with that, right? So that's what this Mishnah means. Barishonah haya oseh beit din b'makom acher u'mevatlo. You would just set up a beit din in another place and cancel that get. A lovely, lovely situation which is disastrous for the woman and potentially the milkman and certainly for the child. Hitkin Rabban Gamliel Hazaken. So Rabban Gamliel Hazaken says, Shelo yehe osim kain. Rabban Gamliel says we're never going to do that again this way. Mipnei tikkun ha'olam. And it's really interesting because here what this means is because the social welfare of this poor woman and the child would have a terrible impact upon them because of what happened this get. So Mipnei tikkun ha'olam, the reason that is in the Mishnah is really, it's a reason that says we don't want to have a terrible impact on a poor, unsuspecting person who could be protected if we legally did things differently. So everybody understand that changes, and now what I'd have to do is I'd have to run after my agent and actually stop him before he got to my wife. There's no way, once that get is in his hands, that I can stop it by having a court proceeding that doesn't have any impact on the get arriving. Okay? So fairness. Sometimes you have to act out of fairness to make sure that the weakest people in a situation are not harmed by the way the law is set up. One more example of that. I'll give you another example in the same Mishnah. Barishonah hayam b'shemeh shemo u'shema. Shem iro v'shem ira. At the beginning, they would write in divorces, they put down your name in one form. Let's say I'm Aaron in the United States, they would write Aaron. They wouldn't put down Aharon or any other name that I might be known by in Israel. And therefore, I could be divorced, but I could claim that I wasn't divorced by saying, that's not really my real name, I use a different name. So now, without reading the rest of the Mishnah, what will happen is they add every name that you could ever be known by to make sure that there's absolutely no problem. Because again, you don't want a woman being in a situation, or a man being in a situation, where their status is unclear, and they are therefore hurt. That's Mipnei Tikkun Ha'olam. We want to repair the world and make sure the legal system actually helps people, doesn't hurt them. Let's look at one last example and then we will close up. We're going to skip Chalitza and Yibum. I think it's a fascinating example, but we don't have time for it. Go to Mishnah Bikurim 3.7, the top of the next page, preventing embarrassment. This is a wonderful passage that talked about reading the declaration that you would make when you do Bikurim. Bikurim, we're bringing of the first fruits to the temple, and the Bikurim, interestingly enough, you know what everybody remember what the declaration is you read? Arami Oved Avi, right? The same one we read in the Haggadah. So, here's what happens here. There was a problem because not a lot of people knew how to read. In fact, literacy rates were probably around 10%, according to many ancient scholars of the ancient world. So here the question was, if you have to come and make a declaration in Hebrew, which it was in Hebrew, and Hebrew, by the way, wasn't even the lingua franca at that point, so there were folks who were speaking Aramaic or Greek or other kinds of languages and didn't know Hebrew very well. So if you can imagine, if you want to set up a religious ceremony that's going to be more and more problematic for people to participate in, put it in a foreign language that's very complicated that they don't understand, and that does a terrific job of that. So here's what happens. Barishonah kol mi sheyodea likrot koreh. At the beginning, everyone who knew how to read would come and read. All right, so what that means is you'd have people showing up with their baskets of food, and they would read, and whoever knew how to read would read. What was happening to the people who didn't know how to read? They were standing there, embarrassed, unable to participate fully, and there were distinctions being made between who was capable and who was not that were quite embarrassing and problematic. So we've got a problem here. So what happens? Anyone who didn't know how to read, makrin oto, they'd read for him. That's even worse. The rabbi has to get up and read for you. Kohen in this case probably, but somebody would have to get up and read for you so that you actually would be embarrassed. So, nimne'u milehavi. They were prevented over time. They stopped bringing the bikurim. So you've got a ceremony that stops working because of the embarrassment factor. This, I think, is a great question for us to think about in terms of synagogue participation, involvement in ritual, etc. It's a fascinating question. So ultimately, hitkinu sheyehu makrin et mi sheyodea ve'et mi she'eno yodea. Ultimately, they decided they would appoint somebody who did read to read for everyone. And that meant effectively that no one would be embarrassed. Whether you knew how to read or you didn't know how to read, you could come and participate in this ceremony and everything would be fine. Ultimately, last 1 minute of comment to kind of conclude for today. I believe very strongly that these are examples, just a few examples of really hundreds of examples in rabbinic literature when the rabbis have to think about changing law. They're not ashamed of it, they're not afraid of it. They actually think that law has to work based on the contemporary needs of the society. And every time we see one of these changes in law, we can bring out a value that I think says to us that we need to continue to be contemporary, we need to continue to evolve, but we also need to remember that we have to protect parts of our tradition as well. And there's always going to be that tension and that balance. We'll talk more about this in the afternoon. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do today for my final presentation in this series of 3 is to talk a little bit about great Jewish literature nobody ever reads. It's material that no one really ever pays attention to. You probably didn't study much of this in school. If you were in school, when I think you were in school, you probably didn't study much of this. People are studying a little bit more of it now, but it's still a relatively rare thing. And this is literature actually from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from Qumran. So how many people have studied Qumran literature in any kind of significant way in the past? So some. Okay, that's good. That's good. All right, well, I'm going to share with you one of my favorite texts from Qumran, which is a text that is a fascinating interpretation of a biblical passage. Then, if we have time, we'll take a look at a piece of legal development that takes place in Qumran, and then a quick visit to the communal scene in Qumran and how the community developed. The reason I want to look at these texts is because one of the things that happened to me when I was in rabbinical school, which was corrected later on when I went to graduate school, was that we thought that there was Bible, and then the Bible got closed, and then there was this big, vast wasteland of 500 or 600 years, and the Mishnah came out after that. And it's really not the case. One of the fascinating things I learned in graduate school to a much greater extent is that there was constant evolution and development between biblical and now in this post-biblical period, which we call the Second Temple period, although not all of the Second Temple period was post-biblical. There's a whole big conversation going on about that too. But during this period between the completion of most of the biblical texts and the Mishnah, there were a lot of really interesting developments. So I'm going to share just 3 with you today, or at least 1 depending on how much time we have. So take a look with me at the first page, and to do this correctly, what I want to do is I want to start by reading together, not, responsively, that's not what I mean, but by reading together a biblical passage from Breshit, from Genesis chapter 12. This is a fantastic little passage which has a lot of problems. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to read it together, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me what's the problem, or what are some of the problems with this biblical passage. It's one you're probably familiar with. So start with me in the Hebrew, where it starts in verse Yud, verse 10, Genesis 12:10. Vayehi ra'av ba'aretz, vayered Avram Mitzrayim. What, did I do something wrong? Oh, you're reading together. Oh, okay. Well, in that case, please rise. Okay.
Joining.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate the support. All right, so Vayered Avram Mitzrayima lagur sham ki chaved hara'av ba'aretz. Okay, so we've got basically, this is a story you've read before, no doubt. There was a famine, a ra'av in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt, Mitzrayima. Remember the directive hey at the end of the word, it sends you in a certain direction. Lagur sham, to live there, ki chaved hara'av ba'aretz, because the famine was severe on the land. Okay, very nice beginning to a story. Vayehi ka'asher hikriv lavo Mitzrayima, when he got close to coming into Egypt, vayomer el Sarai ishto, he said to his wife Sarai at this point actually, hine na yadati ki isha yafat mar'e at. Wow, behold, you are a woman of, I never know how to translate this. Can someone help me with it? beautiful appearance or something like that. You're a good looking. You're good looking. Let's just leave it at that. Okay. So that good looking is very nice. It leaves a certain flavor in the story, which we're going to now see what happens. So now in 12, v'haya ki yir'u otach, when they see you, Hamitzrim, the Egyptians, ve'amru ishtozot ve'hargu oti ve'otach yichayim. So when the Egyptians see how beautiful you are, the implication is here, the statement, they will kill me and take you, basically. Okay? So the issue here, of course, is that a beautiful woman, even if she is married, in a society in which beauty is valued, is somewhat vulnerable, and more vulnerable, in fact, is her husband, because he will be killed to get him out of the way so that folks in the society can, shall we say, have their way with her. Okay? So, this is the setup for a lovely challenge and a lovely problem. Now in 13 we have, Imri na, say please, achoti at, that you're my sister. Leman yitavli ba'avorech, that it will go well for me because of you or through you. V'chayta nafshi biglalech, and my soul may live because of you. So what's the request here? Avram is asking Sarai to lie and effectively say she is his sister, and that way they will try to curry favor with Avram instead of trying to kill him. Because you want to impress the brother, but you want to kill the husband. Okay? So that's the story. Okay? Everybody's seen this before. Let's read on. Vayehi kevo Avram Mitzrayma, vayeru Mitzrim et ha'isha ki yafa hi me'od. Well, they all came into Egypt, and the Egyptians saw how beautiful Sarai was. That she was yafa hi me'od, very beautiful. Okay? Vayeru ota Sarai Pharaoh. And the ministers of Pharaoh, right, the guys who accompany Pharaoh, sort of the secret service of Egypt, saw that she was beautiful. V'yehalelu ota, and they praised her, el paro, and they praised her to Pharaoh. Vatukach ha'isha beit paro, and the woman was taken to the house of Pharaoh. Now I want to stop and focus on the word vatukach for a second. Let's do the binyan. Can we say what binyan that's in? Wow. Nice. Okay, this is good. You must have gone to a very good school. That's all I can say. So the interesting thing here is that the word lakach is the root to take. That word usually in the Bible means simply taking an object, but it also has the meaning of marrying. So vatukach here, interestingly, is a word that implies some sort of connection, possibly marriage, between Pharaoh and Sarai. I just want to put that out there because it might be problematic, okay? So skipping ahead a couple of verses, this all led to some good things for Avram. He got sheep and goats and large cattle and small cattle and male and female maidservants and even some camels. But God was not so happy with it, apparently. So look at 17. Vayinga Adonai et Paro. V'yenaga Adonai et Paro. My text is a little bit corrupted here. So Negaim Gedolim. Bad leprosy of some sort, or bad skin disease of some sort. So God actually afflicts Pharaoh with bad skin disease, all right? Ve'et Beito, and his whole house, al davar Sarai, over the matter of Sarai, Eshet Avram, the wife of Abraham. Okay, so now all of a sudden Pharaoh figures out something's wrong with what's happening with Sarai. And then what?
What did he do?
Well, we're going to get to that, so hang on. That's a problem I want to talk about in a minute. So that's one of the problems with the story. So Vayikra Paro Avram, Vayomer, Ma zot asita li. So Pharaoh figures out that Avram has actually lied to him, or set the situation up so Sarai lied to him, and says, "What is it you did to me? Lama lo higadata li ki ishtecha hi." Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? How did he know? We don't know. That's another problem in the story. So Lama Amarta, why did you say Achotihi? Why did you say that she is your sister? Va'ekachota, and I either took her or married her. Read it as you like. Li leisha, which sounds very much like marriage. Very hard to read that as anything other than marriage, or at least something, some sort of fornication. Let's leave it at that. Ve'ata, and now hine ishtecha kach valech. She's your wife. Take her and go. Vayitzav alav paro anashim. So he then commanded men, Vayishalchu oto ve'et ishto ve'et kol asher lo, and sent all of them out of the land of Egypt. All right? So, here's my question. This is an interesting story. There's no question about it. There are all sorts of resolutions to this in the later commentators. I don't want to deal with those. What I want to deal with is, what are the problems in this story? What are the challenges this story presents when you read just the biblical text? Go ahead.
One problem is this comes at the end of verse 19, when Pharaoh tells to Abraham, uses the same words, now you take her, meaning you go have sex with her just like I had sex with her.
Mm-hmm. So that's a problem. Okay, so there seems to be a matriarch having sex with someone other than her husband, right? So I'm going to call that a problem. Good. Let's go on. Go ahead, John.
Avram is such a righteous man. Why is he lying?
Good. Avram is lying. He's lying. You know, he sets up a whole situation in which he lies and causes his wife to lie, and that leads to all sorts of problems. So a patriarch is lying, a matriarch is sleeping around. That's a problem. Go ahead, Steve. Say that again louder. I'm sorry.
Abraham gets all this material benefit from his deception.
Good. So he ends up walking away with all of the door prizes from Egypt, and he takes them home with him, sheep, cattle, etc., all that kind of stuff. So that's also a problem because he's now being rewarded for the deception and for his wife having intercourse in an adulterous manner. Yeah.
Nothing about a harem.
Nothing about a harem?
Right.
Yeah, well, you know, it would make the movie better if there were a harem. There's no question about it. But I'm trying to think actually biblically if Egyptians are presented as having harems. I'm not sure. So I can't off the top of my head think of an example. There may be one. Go ahead.
Pharaoh was punished, although it doesn't appear that he did anything wrong.
Very good. Pharaoh gets leprosy or skin disease of some sort, even though he didn't really do anything wrong, because if he didn't know that Sarai was Avram's wife, which apparently he didn't, then all of a sudden he's punished for something he didn't know about. He couldn't have known. Yeah.
In the article I wrote on the fall of CCR Journal about these, I thought that there are three stories, well, obviously with this.
Right.
The second story teaches you that she didn't have sex, because the second story, God prevented Abimelech from having sex with Sarah. So here are the plagues, so we shouldn't automatically assume that she had sex with him.
Yeah, now the Abimelech story is a little easier to read that way. When it says here va'ekach and all tukach and all these kinds of words, li leisha. I mean, it's very hard to wiggle your way out of the sex in this passage. I'm just saying. I think it's challenging. So, okay, go ahead.
He's also rather narcissistic from the standpoint that he's being selfish, and he's saying to her, but you're going to live.
He'd say, yes, in other words, he's the one who's protecting himself at the expense of his wife, right? This is a pattern we see often in family therapy, right? So this is good. I don't want to take too many more, but we're going to take a couple more. Go ahead in the back, Jane. She does not have much say. She does what her husband asks her to do, and that's a good question too. That's not. This is I would say a pre-feminist text. Let's just put it that way. Okay.
The problem of adultery. Punishment will be death.
Yeah. So where's the punishment for Sarai? Where's the punishment for Avram, who sets up the situation in which the adultery takes place? Great. Yeah.
What's God's role in all of this?
Good. Right. Where was God before? Terrific. Let's take one more. I'll take three more very quickly, but no. Okay, four more. That's okay.
Isn't the implication that Sarai did tell the truth? Because otherwise, how would we know that Abraham was?
Well, so it doesn't say in the story who told Pharaoh, right? We don't know, but that's one way to potentially read it, that maybe Sarai did tell him. Quite possible. Yeah.
Sarai has plenty to say in plenty of places. What did she say? He said, go with the Pharaoh.
Yeah, she doesn't object. There's no Sodom and Gomorrah moment where she stands up and says, don't do this or anything like that. She could have. Yeah, so she doesn't say anything. Good. Let's take two more. Go ahead, really.
By later Jewish law, Abram would not have been able to take her back if, in fact, she had sex with another man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then they would have set up that little sota ritual and, had her drink that bitter water, and that would have been at least unpleasant, right? Okay. By the way, if I'm the Pharaoh of all of Egypt and I take a woman to be my wife, all of a sudden, it's kind of interesting all of a sudden that God can intervene in that and all, right? But why God has power? I mean, there's a whole other slice which isn't covered in what we're going to read next, but there's a whole other slice of the power of God over foreign kings, which is also very interesting here. I'll just put that out there. Last two comments for real, 1 and 2. Go ahead.
Two comments. One was maybe it was just a question of survival, and we do what we can to survive.
Okay.
Number two, how come Pharaoh let them off so easy? Why did Pharaoh kill them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Why did Pharaoh let them go, and why did Pharaoh give them door prizes? Why did they get to leave with those different things? Very good question, not answered by the biblical story. And last comment, Michael.
First, I think in the story that Pharaoh comes across more as a local chieftain than when he appears in Exodus. And the second thing is you were talking about social context, when we talk about adultery, etc., we're talking in terms of later Jewish law.
Right.
We should really be talking in terms of Mesopotamian law.
True. Yeah, and by the way, there are examples even in later Babylon, in the Babylonian Talmud. I think it's Abaye and Rabbah, if I remember correctly. It might be Rabbah. I think it's Abaye and Rabbah. They go on a little journey to Babel at one point, and when they go out to these little towns, they're given wives for a day. So there may actually be this different concept, different ideal of how it is that that adultery is defined. So anyway, there were what? Swingers. Yeah, the Bavli is really filled with swingers. It's pretty amazing. Anyway, let's. Here's what I want to show you for today, which I think is absolutely fascinating. It's one of my favorite interpretive texts on a biblical text anywhere. If you look down to the next part, the very next bold line underneath the biblical text, this is from something called the Genesis Apocryphon. This is something we scholars study that no one else ever reads. And what it is it's basically a 22-column text that was found at Qumran. It was found in Cave 1. Qumran, there are 11 caves, and when you look at a Qumran text, they usually say 1Q something, and 1 means it's found in Cave 1, Q means Qumran, and then the number that follows is the order of the text that was found. So this text actually is called, it has a name instead of a number at this point. It's called 1Q Apgen R columns XIX through XX. This is actually quite intelligible if you know what it means. So here's what it means. 1Q, found in the first cave at Qumran, which means it was found in 1947 or 48 by that shepherd boy who was throwing rocks into the cave and heard the breaking of pottery and then took this out and sold it to an antiquities dealer. It was the Apgen. Apocryphon means a hidden scroll, something that's been hidden away. There's also the word apocrypha. Apocrypha means books or texts that have been hidden away. It can also mean texts that have hidden meanings in them. It potentially could be read that way too. But this is a text that was hidden away. No one had ever seen this text until it was found in Qumran. Apgen, the Apocryphon of Genesis, the reason it's called that is because in the 22 columns it parallels the books of Genesis from the story of creation in Noah, Lamech, through Avram. So it's kind of a parallel interpretation that goes along with the book of Genesis. Similar to, has anyone ever read the book of Jubilees? That's also a book that kind of parallels and interprets Genesis. And the columns, this is column 19 through 20, so it's towards the end of the document. In fact, if you look on the back page of the handout, you'll see what one of these documents looks like. I'm not sure if that's actually from the Genesis Apocryphon, because I forget when I put it in there, but it is actually it's what these texts look like when you find them. So now I want to read to you.
The AR, Aramaic?
AR means Aramaic. Thank you, I missed that. So that's Aramaic. By the way, texts of Qumran are found in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. So Aramaic and Greek will be mentioned. Hebrew is assumed, so they don't actually put like HE or anything like that. Okay, so we're going to look at column 19. This is now the retelling of this story. I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to, I'll read it and I'll stop here and there because I want you to see the literary artistry in dealing with a very difficult biblical text. So watch what happens. So, by the way, the word vacat is an important word to know. That means, it's like vacation, but it's in Latin. That's where it comes from, the same root. It means a space. All right, so vacat simply means there's a space. Okay? To vacate, same idea. All right, now, there was a famine in all that land, but I heard that in Egypt there was grain. By the way, note immediately, we're talking in the first person here. So this story is a way of getting into the interior character of Avram as he's going through this particular story. It's a fascinating thing that actually arose probably first in Greek literature as characters started to talk about their interior, their feelings, what they were thinking about. And what's great about this passage, immediately you start to see, is that we're seeing how Avram felt and what he did and why he did it as a way to kind of expose the thinking behind this passage. Very, very interesting writing. So there was a famine in all that land, but I heard that in Egypt there was grain. So I journeyed to enter the land of Egypt. By the way, all these brackets indicate restorations. Just to be honest about all this stuff, there are a number of pieces that are left out of this, and people have to restore them. If you see something in brackets, it's a restoration. Okay? And I reached the Carmon River, one of the branches of the Nile. Until this point, we were still within our own land, but now I crossed the 7 branches of this river, and something's missing. Okay? Now we had crossed our land and entered the land of the children of Ham, the land of Egypt. I, Abram, had a dream the night of my entry into the land of Egypt. In my dream, I saw a cedar tree and a date palm growing from a single root. Then people came intending to cut down and uproot the cedar, thereby to leave the date palm by itself. The date palm, however, objected and said, "Do not cut the cedar down, for the 2 of us grow from but a single root." So the cedar was spared because of the date palm and was not cut down. So note the element of the dream that's put in here. This would be very important in just a minute. Then I started from my sleep, Avram continues, while it was still night, and said to Sarai, my wife, "I have had a dream and now am fearful because of it." She replied, "Tell me your dream so I may understand." So I began to explain it to her. And I also explained its significance. This, by the way, goes back to the ancient idea that a dream is almost like a letter. If you don't open it, you have the dream, but you don't know what it means. So you have to have the dream and its significance, the dream and its interpretation, which, by the way, is a lovely analogy to text and its interpretation as well. All right? So I will explain it to her, and I will also explain its significance. I said, "Men will come intending to kill me while sparing you. Notwithstanding, this is the kindness that you can do for me. In every place where we shall go, say concerning me, 'He is my brother.' Thus I may live because of you, and my life may be spared owing to you. They will attempt to separate us and to kill me." Then Sarai wept at my words that night. Okay, so let's, and let me go on for just a little bit more. And the Pharaoh of Zoan is a place that's actually mentioned in the other story that talks about Avram going to Egypt, but not here, and in other places. Sarai no longer wanted to go to Zoan with me, for she was exceedingly careful lest any man should see her for 5 years. Nevertheless, after 5 years had passed, etc. There's a little bit left out here in the passage. What I want to ask you is the following. What does the addition of this dream do to the story? Let's start with that and see how we're reshaping and reinterpreting the story. Hold on, go ahead.
It gives a reason that you can think that there might be something that might happen. And, wow, the rest of this defense is so right.
So interestingly, we have now a reason that we think that Avram knows that something's about to happen that's going to hurt him, and that interestingly, that in the date palm, which I think represents Sarai, the date palm is now given a role to save the cedar. So that's interesting. So somebody else said over here a very good comment, which I don't want to lose. Who said that? Say?
Survival.
It absolves Avram. That is the key point of what this dream is trying to do. What are dreams in the ancient world?
Prophecy.
They're prophecy. This is a way to access what God wants you to do. So what's fascinating about this is, and there's no hint of this at all, it does not exist in the biblical text of any of these stories. What's fascinating here is there is such discomfort during the Second Temple period with the portrayal of Avram and Sarai in this story that they have to come up with a way to take the responsibility for this set of bad deeds away from the patriarch and the matriarch. And they do that by putting a dream in that essentially powers a divine command to them. Now it is God who is responsible for what Avram has to do in saying that he's lying.
You're saying that that's a self-conscious edit. They looked at it,
I think so.
Felt concerned, and wrote as if this were, if you will, possessing biblical truth.
Well, I'm not going to go as far as saying that they saw this as possessing biblical truth. What I will say is this text is presented as a text that comes with certain authority, being written, the fancy word for this is it's pseudo-epigraphical, which means it is written in the name of a patriarch. And it's as if a patriarch is talking himself. So that is a way of getting inside this story and giving it a very different valence. That's what I think is the author's intent of doing this.
It also says that they're brother and sister. They came from the same mother.
Right. Yes. Which is another way of saying that Avram doesn't lie.
He doesn't lie, right.
Right. Did everybody hear that? That's also a great point. They came from the same root, therefore they really are brothers and sisters, or brother and sister, and that means that Sarai is now absolved from lying because they actually are brother and sister. So that's a second way that this dream takes care of the issues in the story. Yeah, go ahead.
Makes Sarai appear much more empathic.
Yeah.
If she feels, he says, look, I'm afraid. And he tells her why he's afraid, and she says, tell me and I'll try to understand. So she comes off as a very empathic person.
She's empathic, and they're a much more well-adjusted couple in this story, right? They are talking about what they fear with one another. It's beautiful, right? They talk about what they fear, and they figure out a strategy together about what's going to happen. But again, powered by God. It is always powered by God. Go ahead.
It makes her into a personality here.
She has a personality, and just wait till we get to the next page. She's going to be more than a personality. You'll really enjoy what happens next. So now she's concerned. Let's go to line 24.
5 years.
Go ahead. What?
What are the 5 years?
I have to say that I don't know what the 5 years are. I've tried to find out what that is, and I don't know what the period of 5 years is. If anybody in the room does, please suggest. But what?
1/10 of a jubilee.
1/10 of a jubilee. Okay, but I don't know. 5 years at HUC. That's it. This means that our programs all have to be 5 years. That is God told me in a dream that it must be kids. All right, let's go on to line 24.
Better told them.
Right? So let's go on to line 24. So 3 men of the princes of Egypt came from Pharaoh Zoan, this Pharaoh, on account of my words and of my wife. They gave me many gifts. Now this is actually a good way to deal with the gifting idea, because what?
Gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Yeah, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. That's what you do when a dignitary comes into your country. You bring them gifts. We do it today, by the way. When people come to visit, we hold a nice little dinner in the rose garden for them, or whatever it is, or and we have gifts for them. It's lovely. So they gave me many gifts. They asked me for knowledge of goodness, wisdom, and righteousness. So I read to them the book of the words of Enoch. Very interesting thing here. The book of Enoch is considered to be what's called an apocalypse, which is Enoch goes up to heaven. He learns all sorts of things from angels and from secret tablets, and then he brings wisdom back down. This was considered to be unique Jewish wisdom that nobody else had, and so therefore this is a way of kind of reincorporating and revalidating the book of Enoch and saying that this was wisdom that Avram had and shared with other people. Of course, Avram lived many hundreds of years before the book of Enoch was written, but nonetheless, when you're writing in the Second Temple period, you take a certain amount of
literary license.
Literary license. Yes, Floyd.
This text?
Say again?
Does that help date this?
Yeah.
Because of reference to the book, but they're like 4.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of books of Enoch. There are about 4, you're right. And this text, I should have mentioned, by the way, is probably from first century CE or BCE, one of those 2 centuries, which means that Enoch would have been, at least part of it would have been created by that time, so it's okay. Okay, so off we go. We have line 26 and 27 are pretty fragmentary. Line 2 in column 20 is where it starts to get really interesting. So now we've got a full description of Sarai. All we've got in the Bible is, Yifat Mareh and words like this, or Yafahi Meod, that sort of thing. Now we're going to get the full story, which is going to heighten this, and it's going to show you how we start to see changes in the writing that takes place in this period from what came before in the terse biblical text. So how and beautiful is the aspect of her face. Luckily, I was going to say if there's anyone under 18 in this room, you should probably leave now, but I don't think we have that problem. So here we go. So pleasant and how supple is the hair of her head. How lovely are her eyes. How pleasant her nose and all the radiance of her face. How shapely is her breast. How gorgeous all her fairness. Her arms, how comely. Her hands, how perfect. How lovely is every aspect of her hands. How exquisite are her palms. How long and delicate all her fingers. Her feet, how attractive. How perfect are her thighs. Neither virgins nor brides entering the bridal chamber exceed her charms. Over all women is her beauty supreme, her loveliness far above them. Yet with all this comeliness she possesses great wisdom, and all that she has is beautiful. This, by the way, I can tell... Say what? It's Shira Shirim, but it's like Shira Shirim on steroids, right? I don't think, or on Viagra. Yeah, right. Thank you, Rick. I appreciate it. Very nice. Oh, I thought that was. I thought I was in trouble with God there. Okay, all right. Anyway, so notice what happens here. This is the report of a guy named Hyrcanus, we find out, who is actually one of Pharaoh's servants, who goes out, meets Sarai, then brings back a report to him, which we'll read that in a second.
Is there any Philo?
What?
Is there any, Philo talks about Sarah and wisdom being, so is that...
The answer is probably yes. There's probably a connection to them. Although Philo, depending on when this was written, they're right around the same time, so could be. Yeah.
How did we get a Hyrcanus in this period?
Well, remember you have somebody in the Second Temple period writing about this, so they selected a name. There's no name given for any of the servants of Pharaoh in the Bible, so they picked a name that they thought would be appropriate.
It's not a reference to this.
It is not a reference, I don't think, to a specific person. No one I could really date. But the point is here, interestingly, she's now gone from a lying adulterer, okay, to the most beautiful woman in the world who's also the smartest and wisest, right? So look at the picture that's being painted now of this matriarch and how this story has really redeemed Sarai. It's just absolutely fascinating because they didn't want to leave her in that condition. It's too problematic to the Jewish people if she's in that condition, her being the mother of all Jews, effectively, right? So when the king, Pharaoh, heard Hyrcanus' words, back in line 8, and those of his companions, for the three of them spoke of one accord, he desired her very much. So he sent immediately and had her brought to him. He saw her and was amazed at her beauty. Thereupon he took her as his wife and sought to kill me. But Sarai said to the king, he is my brother. So notice interestingly here, this story in the Aramaic is very clear. He didn't take her as his wife and seeks to kill Avram. But then Sarai lies, as they had agreed to, and says, he's my brother. Thus she benefited me, and I was spared, I, Abram, by her good graces and not killed. Then I wept copiously, I, Abram, both I and Lot, my nephew, that night when Sarai was taken from me by force. Notice also, the nature of the taking is stronger here. Taken by force, I'm weeping if I'm Abram. There's a tremendous sense of loss that happens to Abram, which is a much more emotional way of looking at this situation than what we've seen in the biblical text. So you really can see how this kind of writing deals much more with the interior of these characters in a very deep and very different way, and also tries to solve the problems that have been presented. Yeah?
And Lot was mentioned.
And Lot is mentioned as well, so this is a whole family tragedy as opposed to, just something happening to Abraham and Sarah. Good. Okay, so let's go on. Now watch what happens. Another beautiful thing that shows up a lot in Second Temple texts is when we're thinking about the interiority of the characters. You'll see this, by the way, if you look at the book of Judith. Before Judith goes out and saves her people, she does a lot of praying and purifying of herself and thinking. And it's a very similar thing here. So that night I prayed, entreating and seeking mercy. In anguish, tears running down my cheeks, I said, Blessed are you, O God, most high, eternal Lord, for you are Lord and master over all. Over all the kings of the earth you are Lord, to work justice among them. And now I seek redress, O Lord, against the Pharaoh of Zoan, king of Egypt, for my wife has been taken from me by force. Render me a verdict against him, and display your mighty hand against him and all his house. May he not be empowered this night to defile my wife. Thus they may know you, O my Lord, that you are Lord over all the kings of the earth. So I wept and spoke to none. So look at the beautiful entreaty, really, that is being given here by Avram, asking God not to let his wife be defiled, and asking God to, in a sense, render a claim against Pharaoh to be able to get, it's not really revenge necessarily, but it's some sort of complaint because Pharaoh has now been the one who took his wife by force. Notice, does Pharaoh know at this point that it's his wife?
No.
That Sarai is his wife? He does not still. So it's interesting that the way the story is constructed here, how could actually Avram make a claim? I think there's a little bit of a hole in the way the story is being constructed, but nonetheless the weeping, the sadness, all this other really heightens this sense of violation that both Avram and Sarai are feeling. Yeah.
But at the very end, Pharaoh doesn't care. He takes her, and then she says, he's my brother. He would have to kill Abraham.
I'm sorry, say again? He could have killed Abraham?
Pharaoh, in the text here,
Yeah.
was about to kill Abram.
Yeah.
So he doesn't care whether brother, cousin,
Good.
husband.
Good.
Was quite prepared to deal with it.
Yeah.
Husband.
Right.
Only when she says he's my brother, leave him alone.
Right.
But he doesn't.
Yeah, so that's interesting also because then maybe that does, I hadn't thought about it that way, but I like what you're saying, because that creates Pharaoh as someone who was willing to do that even though he knew she was married, right? So that is interesting. There's a big alteration of the biblical story. I think you pointed out something really important, so thank you. That's good. Any other comments on that before we move on? So, yeah, go ahead.
Could be that in a time in which Jews are powerless, this invokes the power of our patriarch to invoke a curse, literally.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Praise to God, and God zaps him through the
Yep,
evil
yep.
spirit.
You will see over and over the power of God over foreign kings, over other people is very much stressed throughout the story as a way to make it very clear that God's in charge no matter what. So that comes up over and over, so thank you. All right, let's go on. So I wept and spoke to no one, line 16. That night, and this is going to really set your mind at ease, because you may have thought that Sarai actually had intercourse with Pharaoh over the years that she was with him. But here's the good news. That night, God Most High sent a baneful spirit to smite him and every man of his household, an evil spirit that continued to afflict him and every man of his household. Consequently, he was unable to have sexual relations with her. Indeed, he did not have intercourse with her, even though she was with him 2 full years. At the end of 2 years, the plagues and afflictions grew yet more severe against him and every man of his household. So he sent messengers calling for all the wise men of Egypt, along with all the magicians and healers of Egypt, thinking that perhaps they could cure him and his household of this pestilence. Yet none of the healers, magicians, and wise men were able to cure him. On the contrary, the spirit afflicted all of them too, so that they fled. So we've got a really interesting set of elements here. First of all, you can rest easy because Sarai never had sex with Pharaoh. There was no adultery going on here. We have now dispensed entirely with the problem of Sarai having adulterous relations with Pharaoh. I feel much better. I sleep better at night now that this has happened. And that's really good. The other thing that's interesting here, there's a fascinating little trope that shows up here. Did anybody recognize that what shows up here in terms of the healers and the magicians? What does that remind you of? Of Exodus with Moshe and the plagues. And the idea here again is Egypt, which is supposed to be a place of great magic and lots of interesting superstitious wisdom. Egypt, that place is nothing compared to God. This is another reminder that God is just much more powerful than a king, than an Egyptian magician. It doesn't matter. God is more powerful. End of story. Okay? So now let's see what happens in terms of figuring out the rest of the pieces of the story. We go to line 21. Then Hyrcanus came to me, asking me, Abram, to come pray for the king and to lay hands upon him and cure him, for he had seen me in a dream. The dream shows up at second dream here. Again, God even has to tell Hyrcanus that it's Abram who's the one who can heal. Fascinating kind of twist to the story, nothing like this in the biblical text. But Lot replied, my uncle Abram is unable to pray for the king while Sarai, his wife, remains with him. Oops. Okay. Now go tell the king to send his wife to her husband. Then he will pray for him and he will be cured. All right, so there's a tit for tat. I guess I probably shouldn't say it that way, but you know what I'm saying. There's a quid pro quo, probably better to say it that way. Sorry. Anyway, let's stop the recording for a minute and we'll go back. So, we'll then pray for your healing and we'll get you. There was no Misha Beirach at that point, so there were other things he had to do. Go ahead.
Suddenly, he's talking about her as his wife.
Right.
Knew where did it come from?
Right. It came from Lot, and it came from earlier. Yeah, exactly. So now we're kind of at the point where the secret is out, and we're going to figure out what happens next. So watch what happens next. When Hyrcanus heard Lot's words, he went and told the king, all these smitings and plagues by which my lord the king has been smitten and afflicted her because of Sarai, the wife of Abram. Let him return Sarai to Abram, her husband, and this plague will depart from you. That is the spirit causing the discharges of pus, in case you weren't sure what they were. So he called me to himself and asked me, what have you done to me because of your wife Sarai? You told me she is my sister, yet she was actually your wife. I took her as my own wife. Here she is, take her, go, depart from all the provinces of Egypt. So that's very much right out of the biblical story, but what's interesting is he now understands that now we know how he found out that it was the wife of Lot's slip, I guess, ultimately, that leads to that. And on top of this, get out of all of Egypt. But first, before you go, if you don't mind, pray for me in my house that this evil spirit may be exorcised from us. So I prayed for him, that blasphemer, and laid my hands upon his head. Thereupon the plague was removed from him, the evil spirit exorcised from him, and he was healed. The king rose and gave me on that day many presents, and the king swore to me with an oath that he had not touched her. Then he returned to me Sarai. The king gave her much silver and gold and great quantities of linen and purple dyed garments. He put them before her and before Hagar as well. He restored her to me and assigned men to escort me out of Egypt. Okay, so how does the ending work here? What does that explain or justify in the story?
Why was that? Well, one of the things that's so interesting to me is that, you know, he goes to Egypt, and when he leaves, he takes out what he had before.
Right.
But in this text, they come out wealthy.
Right.
She's got money now. He's got money, and she was never seduced.
Yeah. Yeah. So interestingly here, all these gifts, everything they leave with, but the biblical story doesn't explain why they should leave with anything, why they should get any door prizes, because Pharaoh was angry, he wanted to expel them. The healing element that's now been added has actually created a justification for leaving with something. And that's very nice, because what it does is it solves the problem of why he even let them go, right? You would think
Suggests the prayer works.
the prayer, it suggests that Avram's prayer works, which is, again, a way of heightening the relationship between Avram, our patriarch, the one with a great relationship with God always, is now heightened even further because he can, like a tzaddik, be able to influence God's actions in the world. Very interesting. Way in the back. Hang on one second.
In the unfolding of the story, Sarai tells Pharaoh that Abram is her brother. In the end of the story, the king accuses Abram of saying, tell you.
Yes.
Disconnect.
Yeah, there is a little disconnect, and it's interesting because that also may, I don't know if that's just sort of a slip or if that's something that's meant to heighten the collaborative work of Avram and Sarai. Maybe they speak as one, sort of, you know. So that may be an author's slip, or it may be an author trying to do that. I could read it either way. Go ahead.
This also brings it closer to the Abimelech story, where Abimelech is told, ask the patriarch to pray for you, because he's a prophet, and not your firstborn.
Yeah. There are elements like the word Zoan and this piece at the end that bring these two stories together. So it could be that the author here is, conflating the two stories to some extent. That is likely, I think. And I probably should have brought the Abimelech story too, but you can read it at home if you want to see. Go ahead.
If all of a sudden Hagar appears,
Yeah.
now she's his wife, right? So
Yeah.
wasn't she in the same position as Sarai?
Well, we don't know when this is exactly. I'd have to look in terms of the order, but I think she was the maidservant, right, to Sarai at this point, is probably where it is. So she was probably part of the entourage that went along with them to Egypt, that sort of thing. It is interesting that Hagar pops up in the end because she's supposed to be Egyptian as well, interestingly, right? So that's kind of interesting, too, that she does show up there. But, go ahead.
Also seems to be an interesting view toward Pharaoh. Abram is very conciliatory toward Pharaoh. It's not the Pharaoh of Exodus.
Right.
Pharaoh is a pretty nice guy. At least Abram thinks he is.
Yeah, well, he does call him a blasphemer, and Pharaoh steals his wife and stuff. Yeah, it is. He's portrayed. He's definitely nicer than the guy in Exodus. I give you that, but that's not a high standard. Very funny.
Ephraim Spicer wrote an article about wife-sister motif. And he thought that he could justify that by saying that in Lucy, the wife was also considered a sister. But now we know that he misread the text in Lucy, and it didn't exist anything like that, even in Lucy. So that theory is out of the way. So we are still back at the beginning. Wife and sister, what is their status? We don't know.
Right, and I think, the other interesting thing, other people have read this as sister not being your immediate sister, but someone in your clan, let's say, and that this is about thick in marriage, that you want to marry somebody close in, and that sister therefore could be read that way. And so Sarai, coming from a similar, very close-in family, could have been kind of a sister to Avram. That's another way to read it. Some of the commentators look at it that way and try to explain it that way. So there are lots of ways to explain it. What I think, unfortunately, I have to stop at 3:30. Is that right? Or yeah. Okay. So in the last 5 minutes, then, let me mention what we're going to do with the next two texts for a second. But I want to really wrap up what I think is going on with this text. But before we wrap up, let me just tell you what I was thinking of doing in the other texts had we, in a perfect world, been able to continue studying for a while longer. So the next two texts are basically also texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. One's from what's called the Damascus document, or the Covenant of Damascus, CD, and it's a text that actually talks about Shabbat observance. What I want to mention about that text is we often think that the Mishnah is the first legal code, the first legal material that comes together in an organized kind of way around particular observances. Not true. In fact, at Qumran, a number of texts have been found that are actually very much along the lines of what the Mishnah does. And the section I gave you can take a look at home, has a whole series of legal questions, not questions really, but legal apodictic statements, commands about how one is supposed to observe Shabbat. So not only is there beautiful literary development, such as we just looked at, there's also this beautiful legal development that takes place during this time period. And in fact, one of the things I did as a professor at the New York campus was to fight for a Second Temple literature course, because I think it's so important for people to be able to trace what's happening from the Bible through this time period into the rabbis. There's an enormous amount of interesting material to be looked at there. Last text also is a fascinating text, and you should read it when you go home or later today. It's basically the Robert's Rules of Order for initiation of someone into the sect called the Yachad at Qumran. And it's fascinating because I read this text with students in my classes often, and one of the things that we note about this is it's very much like the initiation process into a fraternity or other kinds of things where people are joining groups. And it always strikes me that it would be very interesting for us to think about what's our initiation process into a synagogue? What does it mean to become part of a community? And I frankly, I will say without going into too much detail here, I don't think we do as good a job of that as we could using the opportunity of when someone's joining. And I'll just give you a very quick story about this. It was Martin Luther King week about 3-4 years ago, and I'm standing with the deacon of an African Methodist AME, African Methodist Episcopal. Yes. African Methodist Episcopal, right. I always get that wrong. But anyway, so I'm standing with the deacon from the local church that we do things with at Westchester Reformed Temple, and she says to me, "What does it mean to join a synagogue?" And so I say to her, "Well, that's interesting. What does it mean to join your church?" And she goes into this long description. First, you have to come to 3 services. You have to declare that you're interested in front of the entire community. Then once that happens, we have 8 sessions where you get to learn about all the different ministries in the church. And then when that's finished, we get to a point where you can then decide to join the church, and then you have to pick one of 300 ministries or 3 of 300 ministries, and you have to join them and start actively participating. Only then can you join the church. Then she turns to me and says, "What's it like to join a synagogue?" So I said, "You give a check to the executive director, and it's pretty much over." So, there's a lot more I could say about that. I'm sorry we don't have time, but look at that text and think about what it means to join a community. There's some really fascinating pieces there. To conclude, the last thing I want to say about the beautiful text we read at the beginning and the other 2 texts that we will hopefully read at home. The beautiful text we read at the beginning is a way of reclaiming a piece of our heritage, of looking at a biblical text that is really problematic, really difficult, and puts people we care about into the wrong light. And there is the courage and the creativity and the thoughtfulness and the ability to project onto individuals in a particularly emotional situation. All of that creativity is used to create an entirely new reading of that story. And that to me is also a very Reformed Jewish thing, because what it is essentially it's a way of saying, even stories that are really difficult for us, we don't throw them out. We don't say, "You know what, I'm discarding this story," but instead I'm going to reconfigure the way I read it, I'm going to rethink it, and I'm going to understand better what's happening to all the individuals in the story, and I'm going to make this piece of Jewish lore that is really difficult for us actually come alive in a way that's really exciting and creates all sorts of good possibilities instead. That is great Jewish writing, and that is the great process of Jewish evolution, which makes me proud to be part of the Jewish people in general, but also part of the Reform movement, because we try to do that as well. So thank you very much for studying.